The night my daughter's future in-laws tried to blackmail me, they brought a cream envelope, a dead man's version of history, and a number they thought would make me blink. What they did not bring was enough truth to survive the coffee. By the time dessert reached the table, their son knew 3 things he had not known when he walked into that restaurant. He knew his father had used him. He knew the story his family had carried for 31 years was rotten at the foundation. And he knew the company he had spent the last 11 months rebuilding did not belong to some discreet board in Cincinnati the way he had always assumed. It belonged to me. If that sounds dramatic, let me help you. It did not feel dramatic in the room. The room was too expensive for drama. Expensive restaurants are built to absorb human embarrassment. Thick carpet, low lighting, waiters who glide instead of walk. The kind of place where reputations come to die politely. Nobody raises their voice because the wallpaper already assumes it has heard worse. I like places like that for one reason. They encourage people to mistake stillness for weakness. That has been useful to me for most of my adult life. My name is Walter Rowan. I am 68 years old. For the last 26 years I have owned Rowan Freight and Cold Storage, which is a sentence that sounds much smaller than the reality. We move food, pharmaceutical product, floral inventory, and enough temperature-controlled freight across 11 states to make boring men with spreadsheets grin into their coffee. We run warehouses outside Louisville, Columbus, Lexington, Dayton, Knoxville, and 3 towns nobody outside the trucking world has reason to know. Last year we cleared a number that would make a venture capitalist pretend not to be impressed, which is the only way they know how to show they are. And yet if you saw me on a Tuesday morning at the farmer's market in Ashford, Kentucky, carrying onions in one hand and a bag of feed in the other, you would probably assume I own a bait shop, not a logistics company. That is partly because I drive a 12-year-old Ford F-150 with a bench seat, polished by use, and a heater that only respects me half the winter. It is partly because I wear scuffed work boots, buy my flannel shirts where normal men buy seed, and have never once in my life understood why a wristwatch should require an app. It is also because I learned a long time ago that if people decide too quickly what you are, they stop looking any further. My late wife Helen used to say, I dressed like a man perpetually one fence repair away from canceling dinner plans. She did not say it to be mean. Helen loved me. She just believed accuracy was a form of intimacy. She had a way of dropping sentences into a room and letting them sit there until everyone else caught up. That gift is one of the reasons I married her. The other was that she could make a kitchen feel like the center of the earth, with nothing more than a tea towel over one shoulder and a look that said, if you lied under this roof, at least have the decency to try harder. I have been a widower for 7 years, colon cancer, fast enough to feel unfair and slow enough to teach you things you wish you had never needed to know. When Helen died, half the color in this house went with her. The other half stayed because our daughter Annie refused to let me turn into one of those men who eats canned soup in silence and tells people he is doing fine because the alternative would require detail. Annie used to show up on Saturdays with groceries I had not asked for, a list of things she claimed I needed, and the same expression her mother wore whenever she suspected I was about to make stubbornness into a personality trait. You should know about Annie before I tell you about Gabriel. She is 29, sharp, funny, patient right up to the point where patience becomes an insult to her intelligence. She works in the education arm of our family foundation, which makes it sound as if I simply handed her a polished office and a nice title. I did not. Helen would have come back and haunted the plumbing if I had. Annie fought her way into that work the old-fashioned way. Grad school, county schools, nonprofit chaos, grant writing, field visits, budget meetings with men who think children are abstractions until you put a real one in front of them. By the time she joined the foundation formally, she knew more about what it ought to be doing than anyone already there. She also inherited her mother's eyes and her mother's very specific way of looking at me when I am trying to be strategic without admitting I am being emotional. Fathers know the look. It says I love you. It also says do not do whatever you are currently building in your head without checking whether it is legal. I met Gabriel Wren on a Thursday in October 2 years ago. Annie brought him to my house for dinner. She called ahead, which already told me she took him seriously. Casual men got warned about my driveway and told to make peace with my dog. Serious men got a call. She said, Dad, I want you in a decent mood. I told her I am always in a decent mood. She said, no, you are always in a managed mood. Those are not the same thing. Then she hung up on me, which is one of the privileges daughters take without asking. I had exactly 42 minutes between that call and their arrival, which was enough time to shave properly, switch from my work shirt into a clean one, and take stock of the fact that I cared much more than I wanted to. Caring about your daughter's choices is complicated. You want to respect her. You also want to stand in the doorway with a flashlight and ask the man in front of you why his face looks so confidently symmetrical. Gabriel did not have one of those faces, by the way. He was good-looking, sure, tall, dark hair, clean jaw, the sort of man who looked like he knew which fork to use without resenting the existence of unnecessary forks. But what struck me first was not polish. It was attentiveness. The man entered my house like somebody who understood that homes have rules even before you know what they are. He took his shoes off without asking because Annie had. He handed Helen's old boxer, Murphy, exactly one hand to sniff instead of lunging at his head. He brought a bottle of red wine that cost enough to show care and not enough to show off. Then he walked into my kitchen, shook my hand once, looked me directly in the eye, and said, "Mr. Rowan, thank you for having me. Annie says your chili can start arguments." I said, "Only with people who mistake cinnamon for innovation." He laughed, but he did not laugh too hard. That matters. We had cornbread, chili, a salad Annie made because she believes every meal should contain at least one leaf that looks like effort, and a pie from Wilma Parker down the road. Gabriel talked well, which is different from talking a lot. He asked questions that had a center. He answered directly. He did not spend 40 minutes trying to impress me with what he had read, where he had traveled, or how many hours he worked. Men who need to sell themselves always think volume is the same as substance. Gabriel spoke like someone who assumed his actual life would carry enough weight if it ever became relevant. By dessert, I knew 4 things. First, he had been raised around money but not softened by it. Second, he was good with pressure. I know what that looks like. Pressure trained me. It did not seem to scare him or seduce him. It simply clarified him. Third, Annie looked happier in his company than she had looked in a long time, which should never be dismissed as soft evidence. Happiness is harder to fake than sophistication. And fourth, there was something under his composure. Not dishonesty. Something tighter than that. A habit of measuring how much of himself a room was safe enough to hold. The next morning I had my chief of staff pull everything public on him. Before anyone gets righteous with me, let us save time. I vetted my daughter's boyfriend. Of course I did. Men who have built companies out of risk do not magically stop recognizing stakes because the risk arrives in a navy sweater and offers to clear the table. What I found was interesting. Gabriel Wren was 34, MBA from Chicago, operations background, moved through 2 national supply chain firms with the kind of progression that suggests capability rather than luck. His last role was at a consumer goods company in Indianapolis, where he had done something very difficult and very unglamorous. He had repaired a failing warehouse network without behaving like a savior. If you do not work around executive personalities, you may not hear the significance in that sentence. Let me help you. Most turnaround people are addicts with better tailoring. They need disaster because disaster lets them perform themselves. Gabriel, based on every internal whisper I could get, was the opposite. He came in quiet, fixed the actual problems, gave other people credit, and left the place boring enough to function. That kind of boring is gold. I said as much to Annie 3 weeks later when she dropped by after work. She was standing at my kitchen counter, slicing pears, and pretending she had not already guessed I had looked into him. I said, "Your young man is annoyingly competent." Without looking up, she said, "That is the nicest thing you know how to say about anyone." I said, "Not true. I once described your mother as surgically honest and difficult to frighten." Annie smiled without giving me the whole smile. Again, Helen. Then she said, "Did you have someone dig into him?" I said, "Sweetheart, dig is a dramatic word. I prefer confirm." She put the knife down and gave me that look. I raised both hands and said, "Only professionally." I did not have anybody comb through his 3rd-grade drawings. She sighed, but there was no real anger in it. She knew me too well for that. Then she said, "Fine, what did the Empire conclude?" I told her the truth. "Your taste appears to be better than I planned for." She laughed, but I filed away the relief in her shoulders. She wanted my approval more than she would ever say out loud. Not because she needed permission, because daughters want the 2 worlds they love to recognize each other without asking them to become translators forever. Over the next 8 months, Gabriel became part of the landscape. Sunday dinners, charity events, one Thanksgiving where Murphy stole turkey from the edge of the counter, and Gabriel, rather than making a scene, simply redirected the dog with 1 scrap and 3 quiet words. A man can learn a shocking amount about character from the way another man handles food theft and old dogs. I also saw him in professional settings exactly twice before the rest of the story properly begins. The first was at a regional logistics conference in Columbus. I was there to keep a relationship warm and terrify a refrigeration vendor into remembering his contract terms. Gabriel was there on a panel about network resiliency and cost reduction. I sat in the back unannounced, in a brown jacket and a ball cap nobody would associate with an owner. He did not know I was in the room. He was very good. Not flashy. The opposite. He had a way of taking complicated operational problems and describing them as if he were setting a wrench on the table. Here's the issue. Here's what it affects. Here's how you fix it. No jargon for sport. No verbal peacocking. No management theater. He answered one hostile question from a private equity man with such calm precision that half the room turned to look at him twice. The second time was less public. One of my vice presidents, a good woman named Sheila Frost, who has spent 20 years making large men regret underestimating her, had been quietly begging me to replace the president of our Midwest Perishables division. The current man was not incompetent. He was worse. He was comfortable. Comfort is terminal in logistics. Product spoils, drivers leave, contracts shift, insurance gets expensive, regulators discover religion. If you get comfortable in that business, the market will perform your funeral. I had already started an executive search when Annie brought Gabriel home. After the Columbus conference, I called the recruiter and added his name. Not because he was dating my daughter. In fact, that part nearly made me exclude him. Family and business are combustible even when everyone involved is trying to be decent. But competence is competence, and I trust what I see more than the rules people invent to avoid looking complicated. So I did what I do when I am torn. I made the process real. The search firm approached him cold. He interviewed with people who were not told what he meant to Annie. Sheila met him. Our CFO met him. 2 outside directors met him. I read every note. None of them knew I had any emotional stake in the outcome. Every single one landed in the same place. Strong operator, unusually grounded, understands systems, good instinct for people, possible successor material if he grows into broader responsibility. It irritated me how much I agreed. When I finally told Annie what I had done, she stared at me long enough that I actually felt 13 for a second. We were on my back porch, late spring, sweet tea sweating into circles on the side table. Murphy asleep under the bench like he paid taxes here. She said, "You had my boyfriend professionally headhunted into your company without telling me." I said, "When you say it like that, it sounds invasive." She said, "Walter, only my wife ever called me Walter when she was deeply unimpressed." Hearing Annie do it felt like time travel with consequences. I said, "All right, yes, I had him recruited. I also made sure the process would survive sunlight. If he were mediocre, he would never have gotten through. If he were arrogant, Sheila would have filleted him and sent me the bones." Annie rubbed her forehead and laughed the way people laugh when part of them is appalled and another part has already accepted reality. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Did he get it because of me? I answered immediately. No. He got looked at because of you. He got the offer because of him. That distinction mattered to me. It also mattered to Gabriel, although he did not know yet that it would. He accepted the role in July. President of Midwest Operations at Rowan Freight and Cold Storage. Base salary high enough to change a man's year. Incentive package serious enough to change a decade. Authority broad enough to tell me a lot about his spine. As far as Gabriel knew, he had been identified by a respected search firm, put through a rigorous process, interviewed by a board, and chosen on merit. That was mostly true. The only missing piece was that the founder who approved the package had already eaten Thanksgiving pie with him, and once watched him redirect a thieving dog without loss of dignity. I stayed out of his way for the first month. That was deliberate. New leaders need room to develop relationships without feeling the owner breathe through the drywall. So I let Sheila onboard him. I let the division show him its scars. I let him discover which warehouse manager inflated labor numbers, which carrier rep could not be trusted past the third decimal, and which refrigeration contractor always seemed to have a cousin in county inspection. Then I started watching. He was even better inside the machine than he had looked from the outside. He cut waste where it needed cutting, and nowhere else. He listened longer than young executives usually can stand to. He did not confuse decisiveness with speaking first, and most importantly, he knew how to tell the truth upward. In my world, that is rarer than brilliance. Plenty of people can build a model. Very few will sit across from money and say, no, that expansion plan is vanity dressed as strategy, and the numbers are lying to you. 3 months in, he did exactly that in a board packet review. He did not know I owned the company outright. He thought he was presenting to an active chair with a meaningful stake and a board with real dispersed authority. Close enough. We met in one of the conference rooms at our Louisville office, the one with glass walls and chairs designed by somebody who never sat through a 4-hour operating review. Gabriel laid out a proposal to expand our Tennessee footprint. Then, halfway through the numbers, he stopped himself. He said, "I can make this look prettier than it is if what you want is a quick yes. But the honest version is that we would be underwriting ego with refrigerated square footage. The contract base is not stable enough yet. We would be borrowing growth from next year to flatter this one. I do not recommend it. Nobody likes hearing that in a room full of revenue people." I did. After the meeting, I told Sheila if he were less competent, I would dislike how much I like him. Sheila said, "That sounds like a personal problem." It was. It remained one. Because somewhere between Thanksgiving, the dog, the search process, and that board review, Gabriel stopped being Annie's boyfriend, who happened to be capable, and started becoming a man I could imagine trusting with something real. That is when his parents entered the story properly. Annie had mentioned them, of course. You cannot date a man for almost 2 years and pretend he hatched fully formed out of a graduate program. I knew they lived outside Indianapolis. I knew his father had been in commercial real estate. I knew his mother chaired the kind of civic committees that produce photographs of women holding oversized checks beside men in navy blazers. What I did not know, not then, was that his father had been carrying my name around in his mouth like a splinter for 31 years. The first odd note came from Gabriel himself. Casual voice, Wednesday evening. We were standing in a warehouse outside Louisville, looking at a badly positioned line of cross-dock inventory that should have embarrassed everyone involved. He said, "My parents have been asking about you more than usual." I kept looking at the pallets and said, "I am flattering myself by assuming this is because of my irresistible conversational sparkle." He smiled. Then his expression shifted, just slightly. He said, "No, I think it is the company. Maybe also Annie. They know things are serious with us. They are curious. People say curious when they mean some combination of interested, strategic, or not finished deciding whether to behave." I turned then and looked at him. He met my eyes. Something in his face told me he had noticed something off, though maybe not enough to name it yet. I said, "Parents tend to get noisy around weddings and money, in either order." He gave a short laugh, then said, "Yeah, something like that." I let it go outwardly. Inwardly, I filed it under pay attention. The second odd note arrived through Annie. She came by on a Sunday afternoon wearing one of Helen's old sweaters and carrying coffee for both of us, which is how she bribes me into family updates. She said, "Gabriel's mother asked me a strange question last night." I said, "Define strange." She sat across from me on the porch swing and tucked one leg under the other, the way she did as a child when she was about to relay gossip with moral significance. She said, "She asked whether you still spent much time in Columbus in the early 90s. That got my attention in a very old part of my body. Not fear, recognition. I kept my voice level and asked, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I have no idea where you spent your time 30 years ago because normal daughters do not keep time-stamped maps of their father's middle age." Then she smiled and said it was just some old business story Gabriel's uncle used to talk about. My coffee went cold in my hand. Annie noticed. Of course she did. She said, "Do you know the name Peter Wren?" There is a certain stillness the body remembers before the mind catches up. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in years, not because I had forgotten it, because I had filed it away somewhere useful. Men put things that no longer deserve daily access. I said yes. She watched me a second longer, then said, "Do I need to be worried?" I could have lied. Fathers do that more than we admit, not always to protect our children, sometimes to protect ourselves from needing to translate old damage into language they can bear. Instead, I said, "Not yet, but I need to make 2 phone calls." That was the start of the week that led to dinner. You learn strange things about yourself if you live long enough. One of them is this. The past does not return as memory first. It returns as weather. After Annie left that Sunday, I stood alone on my porch and felt 31 years old for half a minute. Not because I missed being young. God, no. Youth is overrated. It is mostly bad judgment with stronger knees. What I felt was not nostalgia. It was the exact pressure that used to sit behind my sternum when I knew something had gone wrong, but had not yet decided whether the right response was patience, paperwork, or a tire iron. By 6 that evening, I had called 2 people. The first was Irene Voss. If you ever build anything worth keeping, find yourself one person who remembers numbers more honestly than human beings remember themselves. Irene had been that person for me in the early days. She started as our controller back when Rowan Freight was not yet Rowan Freight. Back when it was 2 trucks, one rented yard in Columbus, a refrigerator trailer held together by negotiation and bad language, and the absolute conviction that if grocery chains needed produce, moved cold and on time, then eventually somebody had to let 2 hungry men do it. Her voice on the phone had only changed around the edges. She said, "Walter Rowan, either a holiday came up and I forgot it, or something is on fire." I said, "Metaphorically only, I hope." She said, "That is never why men like you call women like me." I laughed despite myself. Then I said, "Irene, I need every file reference you still have on Peter Wren." There was silence on the line. Not shocked silence, index silence. The kind that means an old cabinet just opened in somebody's head. Finally she said, "How much trouble?" I said, "Unknown quantity." She said, "Then all of it." The second call was to Dale Haney. Dale is 74 now and walks with the kind of careful stubbornness that dares you to mention it. In 1993, he lost the lower part of his left leg on Interstate 70 when a refrigerated trailer jackknifed outside Dayton after a brake system that should have been pulled from service failed under load. He also lost, for a while, the easier version of his life. He did not lose his mouth, which has remained operational at all times. When I called, he answered on the 4th ring and said, "If this is another Medicare survey, I am dead and you are speaking to a ghost." I said, "Dale, it is Walter." He said, "Well, hell, that's either good news or expensive news." I said, "Maybe both." He was quiet for a second, then said, "Peter, There are people who understand before you finish the sentence because they never really stopped understanding in the first place. I said yes. He said, "When do you need me?" That night I did not sleep much. I sat at my kitchen table with the overhead light on, one yellow legal pad, a mug of coffee that went untouched twice, and the old tin box where I keep things I cannot pretend no longer matter. Helen used to call it my vault of unresolved male nonsense, which was unfair only in the sense that it was accurate. Inside were contracts, old partnership agreements, letters I had never answered, and a slim folder with a label written in my own hand 30 years earlier. P. Wren. There are names that do not belong to the dead. Peter Wren was one of them. He had been too alive when I knew him, too quick, too charming, too hungry for the part of success that other people can see. I met Peter in 1989 in a diesel-soaked yard outside Columbus. I was 37, he was 34. We both had more energy than money and more ambition than common sense. I had spent most of my early 30s working dispatch, route coordination, and cold storage management for men who inherited businesses they were not sharp enough to deserve. Peter had bounced through fleet sales, leasing, and one short, unsuccessful attempt to run a produce brokerage with a cousin who drank his commissions as if cash expired. We got along instantly, which in hindsight should have made me more cautious, not less. Peter knew how to enter a room like a man delivering relief. He made mechanics laugh, warehouse managers talk, and bankers feel taller than they were. He remembered names, pretended not to notice weaknesses until the moment they became useful, and had that dangerous kind of confidence which looks like vision if you're standing too far away. I was better at the work. He was better at people. That combination builds things fast. Within a year we had leased a small yard, signed a regional produce contract nobody expected us to keep, and started moving cold freight between central Ohio and Kentucky with the specific kind of urgency that only comes from knowing one missed delivery can destroy both margin and reputation before breakfast. Those were hard years. Good years too, though I did not know it then. You do not usually recognize the golden period while you are living it, because you are too busy trying not to drown in payroll, diesel prices, and the terrifying silence between invoice and payment. Helen was with me by then. We had been married less than 2 years when Peter became my partner. She liked him at first in the way decent people often like charismatic men before they have enough evidence to protect themselves. She told me once, after a company cookout in our first summer, "Peter makes everybody feel chosen. That is efficient, but it is not the same as being good." I should have listened harder. By 1991, we had 6 tractors, 12 trailers, 1 cross-dock lease, 2 contracts that actually mattered, and a sense of momentum that bordered on intoxication. Peter wanted to scale faster, more equipment, more leverage, more routes. He had begun using the phrase regional footprint before people had the decency to be embarrassed by it. I was cautious. Cold chain logistics punishes theatrical growth. Product spoils, claims multiply, equipment fails. Government inspectors discover imagination. Speed in that business can make you look brilliant right up until it introduces your customers to bankruptcy. We argued about pace often. At the time, I thought that was normal partner friction. Now I understand it was the first clean sign that Peter and I were building 2 different things under the same roof. He wanted visible scale. I wanted durable margin. He wanted expansion. People could brag about at dinner. I wanted drivers who got home, brakes that worked, and receivables I did not need to pray over. For a while, those visions overlapped enough to coexist. Then the numbers started developing shadows. Small ones first. Fuel variants that made no operational sense. Maintenance expenses delayed without explanation. Cash flow stress in months that should have been stable. A trailer sale I did not remember approving. 2 customer complaints about equipment substitutions that had never passed through dispatch. When you build from the ground, you develop a sense for the texture of your own business. That may sound mystical to people who work in cleaner industries. It is not mystical. It is repetition. You know what normal feels like. Then one day, normal comes in half a pound light. I asked Peter about it. He always had an answer. That is one of the reasons smart thieves are difficult to catch early. Honest people sometimes need time to know the truth. Dishonest people keep explanations ready in their pockets because explanation is most of the job. A vendor delay, a leasing adjustment, a routing change, a temporary tax holdback, a miscommunication in dispatch, an accounting lag that would settle next week. Everything plausible in isolation, nothing durable in aggregate. Irene saw it before I did. One evening she came into my office after everyone else had gone. We still shared a real office then, Peter and I, divided by filing cabinets and the illusion that space equals transparency. Irene set 3 ledgers on my desk and said, "I want to show you something before he gets back from Louisville." I said, "He" being. She looked at me the way competent women look at men who need fewer nouns spelled out. Peter, Walter. She walked me through 6 months of records, reclassifications, short-term holds, vendor addresses that did not quite align, check requests routed oddly. A service company registered under a different name but billing in patterns too close to our own work cycle. I remember a very specific sensation while she talked. Not outrage, not yet. It was the physical unpleasantness of realizing that part of your life has been happening without your consent. I asked if she was sure. She said, "I am sure enough to ask whether you want proof or peace." That is an important distinction. Most people say they want the truth. What they actually want is reassurance. Proof is more expensive. I said proof. For the next 4 months, I lived 2 professional lives. In the visible one, Peter and I ran the company. Contracts, routes, hiring, claims, fuel negotiations, business travel, the exhausting normal theater of keeping a freight operation upright. In the hidden one, Irene and I documented him. We traced payments to a shell maintenance vendor, registered in his sister-in-law's maiden name. We discovered he had been diverting loads and small accounts to a shadow brokerage he controlled through a leasing intermediary. We found payroll tax holds he had delayed to free cash he could move short-term. Worst of all, we found maintenance deferrals on 2 older refrigerated trailers that should have been pulled from rotation months earlier. That last part is the piece I still feel in my teeth. One of those trailers was Unit 18. Dale Haney was driving it eastbound outside Dayton when the brake system failed under wet conditions. The trailer jackknifed, the cab spun, the load shifted. Dale survived because stubborn men survive things that logic would not bet on, but the lower part of his left leg did not. The investigation, public and insurance-based, never found fraud. It found poor record integrity, inconsistent vendor servicing, and a set of maintenance signatures that somehow seemed complete on paper while never having occurred in the real world. I had not known then that Peter himself had routed those maintenance holds. When Irene and I connected the service logs 3 months later, I was sick in a way I had not known a grown man could be without lying down. Peter had not just been stealing. He had been borrowing against trust, safety, and another man's body. That is when something in me went still. People imagine anger as noise. Often it is not. Often anger, real anger, is a kind of refrigeration. Everything in you drops to the temperature needed for preservation. I spent the next 2 months assembling a file: bank records, dispatch logs, service invoices, registration papers, tax notices, copies of altered internal memos, handwritten notes from mechanics about pulled parts that had somehow reappeared as completed work. Irene helped. So did a young operations clerk named Benji Cross, who was too naive to know he was being brave. And eventually, after I showed him enough, so did Dale. I need to say something important here, because men like Conrad Wren never do. Peter was not railroaded. He was not framed. He was not muscled out by a friend who wanted more. He was given mercy he had not earned. I confronted him in February of 1993 in the back office of our Columbus yard. The old floor there still had a soft patch by the window where rain got in if the wind came from the wrong direction. The desk lamp leaned. The coffee tasted like punishment. I remember those details because memory gets petty when the larger fact is unbearable. I set the file on the desk between us. He looked at it, then at me, then back at the file again with a face that tried to stay relaxed for a full 4 seconds before self-preservation took over and burned the expression down. He said, "Walter, what is this?" I said, "You know what it is." He tried indignation first, then insult, then familiarity, then woundedness. That sequence taught me more about character than any sermon ever has. When guilty men lose control of the room, they run a whole ladder of selves hoping one of them still works. By the time he got to outrage, I had already handed him photocopies of 3 things he could not explain away: the shell company registration, the false maintenance sign-off on Unit 18, and a set of diverted customer payments routed through his brokerage. His face changed then, not into remorse, into arithmetic. I told him he had 2 choices. First option: I take the file to our counsel, our insurers, the state revenue office, and if necessary, the county prosecutor. He loses his stake, his license relationships, his reputation, and likely his freedom. Dale sues, our customers find out, the company bleeds, everybody burns. Second option: he signs away his ownership, dissolves the shadow operation, repays what can be traced through liquidation, leaves the business immediately, and disappears far enough that I never have to hear his voice in a warehouse again. In exchange, I keep the criminal side of the file locked unless he ever resurfaces claiming victimhood. It was not mercy because I loved him. It was mercy because at 37 I still thought containment was nobler than detonation. Peter chose the second option before sunset, not because he was noble, because he understood jail. He signed in 3 places. He cried once. I do not mention that with pleasure. I mention it because the tears came exactly when he realized I had the maintenance file on Dale. Theft he thought he could spin. A man's leg was harder to sentimentalize. He left Columbus within a month. I rebuilt alone. That sentence makes the next 3 years sound cleaner than they were. They were not clean. They were brutal. We lost contracts. We refinanced. I sold the first house Helen and I bought together. I slept in my office more than once. I learned exactly how much humiliation a bank officer can wrap in a sympathetic tone. I also learned that a company built around work can survive betrayal more often than a family myth built around grievance can survive facts. Peter, from what little I heard, drifted. He went south, surfaced once in Arkansas, then Tennessee, then nowhere stable. Years later, I was told he died of liver failure in a town I had never visited. By then, I had no appetite left for his ending. What I did not know, what I truly had no reason to know, was what story he had told his family in the years between disappearance and death. According to Annie, and later according to Gabriel himself, the version Conrad Wren had grown up with went like this. Peter had trusted his partner. Peter had built the company's customer base. Peter had been muscled out after a bookkeeping dispute. Peter had been threatened into signing away his share. Peter had been ruined by a colder, richer, more ruthless man who used paperwork as a weapon. Notice what drops out of that story. The shell company, the diverted loads, the tax holds, the trailer maintenance, Dale Haney. Grievance is always cleaner if you remove the victim who can still tell the truth. By Tuesday of that week, Irene had sent me scanned copies of everything still in her archive. She had kept more than I expected. Irene keeps paper the way churches keep relics, not sentimentally, defensively. Every audit trail we had preserved, partnership dissolution documents, copies of Peter's repayment acknowledgments, vendor links, even notes from the insurance review around the Dayton crash. By Wednesday, Dale had agreed to sign a fresh affidavit. He came to my house Thursday afternoon with a cane, a courthouse face, and a grocery bag full of tomatoes from his wife, because apparently no meeting between aging Kentuckians is allowed to remain purely legal. We sat at my kitchen table. He signed every page without drama. Then he looked at me and said, "You know, this means they are coming for something bigger than apology." I said, "Yes." He said, "What do they think you have not kept?" I smiled without feeling much of it and told him, probably the same thing most people assume about old men in flannel shirts, that we got soft because we got comfortable. He snorted and said, "Well, that is on them." The last piece I needed came from Sheila. I asked her for a clean summary of Gabriel's first 11 months leading Midwest operations, not because I doubted him, because by then I suspected whatever happened at dinner would eventually require me to separate the son from the parents in language no one could dispute. She gave me a 3-page memo that read like the written version of a respectful eye roll. Saved $4.7 million in avoidable spoilage and lane inefficiency. Reworked the Louisville outbound grid without alienating dispatch. Cut vendor leakage in Knoxville. Replaced 2 weak managers after giving them a fair chance. Rejected a vanity expansion plan with rare honesty. Potential future enterprise leader if emotionally durable. I read that last line twice. Potential future enterprise leader if emotionally durable. That is corporate language for this man is good, but life may still get a vote. By Friday morning I was almost ready. What I still did not know was whether Gabriel understood he was being used. That question mattered more than any document in Irene's files. So I invited him to breakfast. Not at the office. Too formal. Too many walls that belong to work and make men default to titles instead of truth. I took him instead to a place in Ashford called Millie's, which serves eggs the size of self-respect and coffee that could strip paint if correctly motivated. He arrived on time in a navy quarter-zip jeans and boots, still carrying warehouse dust on the edges. That pleased me more than it should have. We ordered. He asked about Murphy. I asked about the Dayton facility transition. We spent 10 minutes being men who could have been there for any ordinary reason. Then I said, "Annie mentioned your mother asked about Columbus in the early 90s. He looked at me directly. That saved time. He said, "Yeah." I said, "How much have they told you?" He exhaled once through his nose and looked toward the window. Outside, a grain truck rolled past and Millie yelled at somebody in the kitchen about hash browns. Life is good at placing ordinary noise around moments that could otherwise feel theatrical. Finally, Gabriel said, "Not much. My father said there was history between our families. He said my Uncle Peter got cheated by a partner years ago. He said he did not want it coloring my relationship with Annie, so he tried to keep it separate. Then, recently, he got more interested, more specific. I let that sit. Then I asked, more specific how? Gabriel took a sip of coffee, which gave him exactly enough time to choose honesty without making it look rehearsed. He said, he asked what active role you still have in the company, asked who really controls voting, asked how long Annie has been tied to ownership structures. He also asked whether you still keep personal archives. There it was, not curiosity, inventory. I said, and what did you tell him? He met my eyes again. Good man, he said not much, because it was none of his business. Also because the tone felt wrong. I nodded once. Then I said something I had decided on in the truck and not 1 second earlier. Gabriel, if your father puts an old family story on the table in front of me, I want you to watch 2 things. Not just what he says. Watch what he leaves out. And watch how fast he assumes I no longer have paper. He did not smile. He said, are you telling me I should cancel dinner? I said, no, I am telling you I do not cancel dinners. I would rather understand. That landed. I could see it. He asked, are you walking into something? I answered truthfully. Almost certainly. He looked down at his plate for a second, then back up. He said, if this turns into something ugly, I need you to know I did not build it. I believed him before he finished the sentence. Not because I am sentimental, because guilt sounds different when it is real, and Gabriel did not sound guilty. He sounded like a man who had noticed movement in the walls and was trying to figure out whether the house was still safe. I said, I know. Then, because I am still a father even when I am also an owner and an old partner, and a man carrying a file older than my daughter's career, I added the only other thing I thought mattered. Whatever happens, Annie does not pay for her parents, and you do not pay for your uncle. He nodded once. That was the breakfast that took us to dinner. By the following Tuesday, Annie was engaged. I promise I am not stacking events for effect. Real life does that on its own when it decides your week is not crowded enough. Gabriel proposed at the Botanical Gardens in Louisville on a rainy evening, because apparently my daughter, who spent half her childhood climbing fences and once split her chin open trying to jump a creek, still contains a hidden woman who can be won over by greenhouse glass and string lights. She came to my house afterward with her left hand out, and her face lit from the inside in a way that made me miss Helen so hard I had to turn toward the stove for a second and pretend a kettle needed monitoring. The ring was tasteful. Thank God. I said, well, he has 1 point in his favor already. She laughed, then started crying, then laughed again because Annie has never enjoyed being seen crying and considered it a design flaw in her own face. I hugged her. Held her longer than I normally would have. Then Gabriel stepped in with the careful look of a man who knows some hugs are not primarily about him and is decent enough not to act otherwise. I shook his hand first. Then I hugged him too. If you are a man and you have never hugged the man who just asked to marry your daughter, let me save you the guesswork. It is like embracing both a future son and a very specific risk assessment at the same time. I said, congratulations, you have done something either brave or foolish. The line moves depending on the decade. He laughed. Annie told me later that he exhaled for the first time in 2 hours only after I said that. Now, because this matters, I need to tell you what I did not tell either of them that night. 3 months earlier, on Annie's 29th birthday, the Rowan Family Trust had shifted as designed. Helen and I set that trust up when Annie was 12. Not because we expected drama, because real money without structure is just future chaos wearing a nice suit. We had 1 child, 1 operating company, 1 foundation we wanted protected from opportunists, and 1 marriage strong enough to talk plainly about death before death made the talking non-optional. The trust had always been built to do 3 things: protect the company from panic, protect Annie from marriage, protect any future child of hers from both family sentiment and family stupidity. On paper, I remained sole owner of Rowan Freight and Cold Storage directly. That part was simple and useful. But the trust sat above the next layer: voting transitions, contingency rights, governance triggers, succession protocols. If I died, Annie would not inherit chaos. She would inherit a machine that knew what it was doing. More importantly, if I lived long enough to see her choose a partner, that partner could never simply marry his way into leverage. Helen insisted on that point so firmly that I once told her she sounded like a Scottish banker in pearls. She said, good, then write it that way. So we did. When Annie turned 29, 1 internal threshold changed. She became controlling beneficiary on the trust side and acquired the majority voting rights that would matter if anything happened to me or if I voluntarily accelerated transition. She did not yet exercise them day to day because I am not dead and have not lost my appetite for decisions. But legally and structurally, the future had already moved closer to her than most people understood. I had not told Gabriel because there was no reason to burden a young man in a working relationship with governance structures that would only matter later and only if he proved himself over time. I had also not told Conrad Wren because, until Annie mentioned Peter's name, I had not known Conrad Wren was even a man I should be keeping from information. By Wednesday, Gabriel called. He said, my parents want to have dinner this Friday. They say it is time everybody met properly before Annie and I start planning anything real. I was sitting in my truck outside the Lexington yard, looking at a forklift operator who had just made an avoidable mistake with the full confidence of a man whose life had not yet trained him against confidence. I said properly is an ambitious word. Gabriel did not laugh. He said, I can decline it. That was the second time he offered me an exit. Pay attention to that. Good men reveal themselves in the exits they create for other people. I said, no, we are not declining anything. Where? He named a private club in Indianapolis called Hawthorne House. I knew it by reputation. Old wood, steakhouse food, lawyers, developers, philanthropic committees with phrases like legacy stewardship in the mission statement, a place where rich people confuse upholstered chairs with civilization. I said, what time? He said 7. Then he paused. Small pause. Real one. He said, Walter, I'm not sure what this is. I answered, that makes 2 of us. He said, if my father starts something, I cut in. Do not defend what you do not understand yet. Silence. Then a low exhale. He said, fair enough. After we hung up, I sat for another minute with one hand on the steering wheel and the old weather returning to my chest. Then I called our counsel. Not outside counsel. Too slow and too theatrical. I called Mary Finch, who has been our general counsel for 14 years and possesses the face of a school principal who would absolutely ruin a corrupt mayor's month if the paperwork justified it. I said, Mary, I need two things. First, a clean summary of any current public filing that would reflect my active ownership role. Second, I need to know exactly how much of the trust structure an opposing party could infer from Annie's engagement if they were asking the wrong questions for the wrong reasons. She said, opposing party. I said, possibly. Family flavor. Mary did not waste time on sympathy. She said, when do you need it? I said, yesterday. By that evening, she had me a packet. Publicly, I remained exactly what I had always preferred to look like. Founder, controlling owner, active chair. Enough truth to be dangerous. Not enough detail for a hostile family dinner to reverse engineer what Annie actually represented. The trust, unless someone had access to private instruments, looked like private family architecture. Which it was. You do not owe predatory curiosity better windows. Thursday night, Annie came over to finalize some preliminary engagement nonsense, which mostly consisted of her opening 3 wedding websites, closing all 3 in disgust, and declaring that the wedding industry had become a hostage negotiation in white lace. I grilled chicken. She sat on the counter in socks because she has never believed chairs are mandatory in her own father's kitchen. About halfway through dinner, she said, Gabriel's mother texted me again. I set my fork down. What now? She imitated Vivian Wren's voice in a way that was so cruelly accurate Helen would have applauded. She said, darling, before tomorrow, would your father be comfortable discussing old Columbus matters if they come up? Conrad still feels some pain there. I asked, what did you say? Annie speared a green bean with more energy than the vegetable deserved and said, I said if Conrad has pain from the early 90s, he should consult an orthopedist, not my father. I laughed hard enough that Murphy came in from the hall to make sure I had not dropped food. Then Annie got quiet. She said, should I be less amused? I looked at her across the table and saw what daughters rarely show unless they trust you deeply. Not fear for herself. Fear of becoming the place where 2 older men decide to settle history. I said, sweetheart, tomorrow night you stay out of it. She frowned immediately. No, I said yes. She said, I am not leaving Gabriel alone with whatever this is, and I am not leaving you alone either. I said, Annie? She leaned back and crossed her arms. A move from childhood that now looks much more expensive in cashmere. She said, if they think they get to have a mysterious grievance dinner about my fiancé and my father and I am supposed to stay home like a decorative lamp, they are out of their minds. Reasonable point. Bad timing. I did the math silently. If Annie attended, Conrad would either perform or escalate. He would also have an audience he could try to manipulate emotionally. Grievance men love daughters. Daughters create the illusion that civility still matters. If Annie did not attend, the room stayed smaller, cleaner, uglier faster maybe, but uglier in a usable way. So I told her the truth. If there's a weapon on the table, I would rather it arrive where there are fewer people to miss. She stared at me. Then she said the sentence that proves lineage as surely as blood work. You think there will be a weapon? I answered, I think there will be paper. That satisfied nothing, but it satisfied enough. We compromised the way strong-willed families compromise, poorly. Annie would not attend dinner. Gabriel had already framed it to his parents as a first direct meeting between me and them before we folded Annie into planning. It gave them the room they wanted. Fine. Annie would stay at my house that evening until she heard from one of us. Also fine. She made me promise to text when I sat down, when I stood up, and if anyone used the phrase old family hurt in a manipulative tone. I said, now you are regulating language in advance. I am proud and annoyed. She said, yes, that is the relationship. Friday came gray and cold. I spent the morning doing real work because idle hours before unpleasant things are where imagination earns too much authority. Signed 2 contract revisions. Reviewed spoilage claims in Dayton. Had a 90-minute call with a refrigeration vendor, whose competence I would have rated higher if he had not said proactive synergy and temperature touchpoint in the same sentence. At 1 o'clock, I met Mary Finch in my office. She came in carrying a thin leather folder and wearing the expression she reserves for situations where human beings have once again confused family with entitlement. She reviewed everything one last time. If they threaten public accusations, you say very little. If they request money, you request specificity. If they reference Peter Wren's departure, you do not argue first. You let them define the myth in their own words. If Gabriel appears genuinely unaware, you do not scorch the room on his body. If he appears complicit, you and I will be discussing employment transition Monday. I said, ruthlessly concise as always. She said, I bill by the hour and still resent inefficiency. Then she slid one more document across the desk. A short internal resolution confirming what I already knew, but might need said out loud later. Annie Rowan, controlling beneficiary under the Rowan Family Trust, with future majority governance rights attached to Rowan Holdings upon trigger conditions already partially vested. I looked at it and thought, Helen, you old genius. Mary noticed the look. She said, Helen would have enjoyed this. I said, only if the appetizers were bad enough to justify her disappointment in the venue. Mary almost smiled. When she left, I opened my top desk drawer and took out the smaller of the two envelopes I had prepared. White, clean, thick enough to hold the kind of truth men like Conrad hate because it comes tabbed. Inside were copies of everything I needed but hoped not to use all of Peter's dissolution agreement, the Shell maintenance vendor registration, the service deferrals, the affidavit from Dale, the archived memo from Irene, the summary of Gabriel's performance, the internal governance confirmation around Annie. Paper is a beautiful thing. It does not need confidence. It does not sweat. It simply waits. At 4:30, Gabriel called again. He said, I need to tell you something before tonight. His voice had changed, not shaken, sharper. I went still. I said, tell me. He said, my father asked this morning whether you still sign any major debt personally. He also asked whether Annie has separate counsel on family holdings. I looked out the window of my office at a line of trailers sitting perfectly aligned in the yard and felt old anger drop into place like a tool I had used before and never thrown away. I said, and what did you say? He answered immediately. I told him I do not discuss my fiancé's family finances with anyone. I also told him if he plans to make me regret bringing Annie into this family, tonight is his last clean chance not to. Well, there are moments when a man's estimation of another man changes shape permanently. That was one. I asked, what did he say to that? Gabriel said, he said I was being dramatic. I actually laughed then. Gabriel did too, but only once. Then he said, Walter, if this goes where I think it might go, I need one answer before we walk in. I waited. He asked, did your history with my uncle involve something real enough that I am about to be embarrassed by blood? That is a hell of a question. I could have given him the summary. I did not. You do not compress 31 years and a man's leg into a pre-dinner sentence. So I answered the cleanest way I could. I said, yes, it involved something real. And no, the shame in the story is not mine. He was quiet for a beat, then said, all right, that all right was not resignation. It was commitment. He was coming. I left Ashford just after 5. I wore a charcoal sport coat, pressed jeans, brown boots, polished more out of respect for Annie than for Conrad Wren, and the same silver watch Helen bought me for our 20th anniversary because she said, if I insisted on wearing practical things, they could at least be beautiful once. The drive to Indianapolis took just under 2.5 hours. Long enough for radio voices to become irritating and then meaningless. Long enough for me to remember Peter's face at the office desk in 1993. Then replace it with Annie's face on the porch swing this week, because that was what really mattered now. Not a dead partner, not an old file. My daughter was building a life. Someone had decided old grievance might buy them terms inside it. That is when history stops being history and becomes an intrusion. I parked at Hawthorne House at 6:52. Valet young enough to call me sir without irony. Stone entry. Warm lights. Low brass signage. The smell of oak and old money trying to look understated. Gabriel was waiting just inside the lobby. He wore a dark suit without a tie, which I respected. Ties are for trials and funerals unless you are compensating for a lack of interesting thought. His hair was neat. His face was not. There was a tension in his jaw that had not been there at Millie's. He stepped toward me and said, thank you for coming. I said, if your father wanted me cornered, he should have chosen a cheaper restaurant. I do better in familiar disappointment. That got a real laugh out of him. Good. Then I looked at him more carefully and asked, how bad is it? He hesitated. Honest hesitation, not styled. He said, I do not know, but my mother has been too warm by text all day, and my father asked if the club had private dining rooms. I assume that means one of two things. He either wants discretion or theater. Sometimes those are cousins. I said, usually siblings. He nodded once. Then we walked in together. I need you to picture the room because settings do half the work in stories like this. Private dining room off the main floor, 2 sconces, walnut paneling, one painting of a hunt scene that probably made somebody's grandfather feel appropriately civilized. Round table, not rectangular, which is always interesting because round tables suggest equality while still leaving plenty of room for ambush if the right people sit close enough. Conrad and Vivian Wren were already there. Conrad stood when we entered. Mid-60s. Broad shoulders gone a little soft, but not enough to stop believing broadness is a credential. Expensive watch. Hair still mostly dark in the suspicious way that requires maintenance. A face that had likely served him well in rooms where confidence and entitlement could be mistaken for leadership if the lighting helped. Vivian rose more elegantly. Cream jacket, pearls, smile prepared a few minutes early. There are people who greet you as if they are receiving you. There are others who greet you as if they are managing the optics of your arrival. Vivian was the second kind. She touched my forearm lightly and said, Walter, finally. We have wanted this for so long. That sentence alone almost made me enjoy myself. Conrad shook my hand with both of his. That move means one of two things: deep sincerity or ambitious control. I have yet to see a third category. He said, "Thank you for making the drive." I said, "My daughter tends to matter enough that I will go where the questions are." Something passed through his eyes at that. Not anger. Adjustment. Good. We sat. Gabriel took the chair between his parents and across from me. Not ideal. Useful anyway. Menus arrived. Water arrived. We went through the first 10 minutes the way people do when they have all agreed to behave until someone decides the cost of behaving has become inefficient. Vivian asked about Ashford. I told her I still grow peppers and tomatoes in the back garden because if you let logistics own your whole brain, you eventually start thinking in pallet counts and deserve to suffer. Conrad asked how often I still visited our Ohio facilities. I said enough to keep people honest, and not enough to ruin their initiative. Gabriel talked about Annie with a softness I noticed because men like Conrad rarely do. Vivian said something charmingly false about loving strong daughters. Meanwhile, I watched. Conrad's smile arrived before his eyes. Vivian's warmth was too evenly distributed. Gabriel spoke carefully around my role at the company, not because he was hiding anything from me, but because he had clearly decided his parents had not earned more information today than yesterday. Then the waiter set down bread, and Conrad reached inside his jacket. I felt my entire body go very calm. He placed a cream-colored envelope on the table between us with the kind of deliberate gentleness men use when they want the object to do some of the talking for them. There it was. Nobody decent enjoys a man who brings paper to dinner unless the paper ends with a check or a will. Conrad set the envelope down in front of me as if he were placing a family artifact between two men who both knew what it meant. That was the first tell. He expected recognition to do some of the intimidation for him. People are always disappointed by how little intimidation survives contact with preparation. He folded his hands and leaned back just enough to suggest patience instead of threat. Vivian lifted her wineglass. Gabriel looked at the envelope, then at his father, then at me. He did not touch anything. His shoulders had gone tight under the suit jacket. Conrad said, "Walter, there are things in every family that only stay buried because the wrong people benefit from quiet. We have reached a point where quiet no longer serves anyone." That is a sentence built in a workshop. You can hear the sanding on it. I looked at the envelope, then at him. I said, "If you have something to say, Conrad, you can save the stationery and try the nouns." Vivian gave the smallest possible smile. Social women love a sharp line right up until the sharpness threatens their own side of the table. Conrad did not smile. He said, "My brother Peter spent the last years of his life believing he had been robbed by a man he trusted." The room did not react outwardly. Inside me, something old simply stood up and took its place. I reached for my water, took one sip, and set the glass back down carefully. Conrad continued. He said, "For years I kept out of it. My father believed some battles were too stale to fight. My mother believed old business could not be repaired by making more of it. Then Peter died with bitterness still in him. And I realized silence has a way of becoming complicity if you let it sit long enough. There is a kind of grief I respect. It bends a person toward humility, because the dead no longer need defending more than the living need honesty. Then there is grievance wearing grief's coat. It speaks with moral urgency because urgency lets people avoid details. Conrad spoke in that second language. I let him. That is one of the few advantages age gives you if you use it correctly. Younger men rush to correct lies because lies feel like sparks. Older men know some sparks are more useful if you let them show you where the fuel is. So I said nothing. Conrad took my silence as room. He slid the envelope a little closer. Inside are copies of agreements, repayment demands, and correspondence from 1993. You know exactly what period I mean. They show that Peter was pressured into surrendering his share of a business he helped build. They show threats. They show a coercive financial arrangement. They show what happens when one partner has more paper, better lawyers, and fewer scruples. Gabriel spoke then for the first time. His voice was controlled but thinner than usual. He said, "Dad, what exactly are you doing?" Conrad did not look at him. He said, "Cleaning up a wrong that should have been cleaned up years ago." That told me more than anything in the envelope could have. If he could not look at his own son while naming the purpose, then he already knew part of what he was doing would not survive direct eye contact. Vivian stepped in with the tone women like her save for moments when they want firmness to sound maternal. She said, "Gabriel, nobody wants this to be ugly. But if Annie is joining our family and you are building your future inside Mr. Rowan's company, then the history between these families can no longer be treated as irrelevant." Mr. Rowan. That amused me. I had been Walter when they wanted warmth, Mr. Rowan now that they wanted leverage. I still did not open the envelope. Conrad noticed. Of course he did. He said, "I think you should read it." I said, "Maybe later." He frowned slightly. He said, "Later." I picked up my bread knife, cut a piece of rye, buttered it, and said, "If I'm going to be blackmailed over dinner, Conrad, I would at least like the carbs not to feel neglected." Gabriel looked at me then, quick, involuntary. The look of a man trying to determine whether the older man across from him is offended, amused, or dangerous. The answer for that moment was yes. Conrad's mouth tightened. He said, "Nobody is blackmailing you." I nodded toward the envelope. "Then what would you call bringing selective documents into a private room, invoking my daughter's engagement, and making sure your son is seated in the middle of it?" That landed. On Gabriel most of all. He turned fully toward his father then and said, "You told me this was dinner." Conrad finally looked at him. He said, "And it is. Men are having a necessary conversation." I almost laughed. There is something nearly athletic about the confidence some fathers have in using the word men to excuse behavior that would embarrass a teenager. Gabriel said, with respect, "If this involves Annie, my job, and your brother, then it involves me a lot more directly than that sentence suggests." Good. Conrad's jaw moved once. He was recalculating. I could see it. He had hoped to use Gabriel as atmosphere, not opposition. Parents who treat their adult children as placement rather than people are always frustrated when those children develop agency at the wrong moment. Vivian touched Gabriel's sleeve lightly. She said, "Darling, nobody is against you." Gabriel pulled his arm back. Not dramatically, just enough. Then he said the sentence that bought him more grace from me than he knew. "If nobody is against me, you could have told me before we sat down." Silence. Even the waiter seemed to feel it from the hallway because nobody entered. Good staff can smell collapse. Conrad made a mistake then. Not a large mistake. Those are easier to defend against. He made a small one born from certainty. He said, "I did not think you were ready to hear how ugly some men can get when money is involved." I leaned back in my chair and looked at him properly. I said, "Since you are clearly narrating me now, you might as well go all the way. Tell the story the way you tell it at home." Conrad held my gaze. Then, perhaps because he had spent years waiting for a stage and decided he had earned it, he obliged. "Peter," he said, "built that company with you. He brought you customers. He made relationships. He expanded routes. When things got tight, you used a bookkeeping dispute and your legal advantage to force him into a surrender. You dressed coercion up as governance, threatened public scandal, and took the company for yourself. My brother never recovered financially. My parents never recovered from watching it happen. And now, decades later, your daughter is about to marry my son and your company is benefiting from his labor. Do you see why the word history feels a little thin? Not a bad speech if you ignore the fiction." I finally opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies, neatly tabbed. Peter's signed dissolution agreement. A repayment schedule. 2 letters from my lawyer at the time, written after Peter missed the first reimbursement installment. 1 memo, apparently copied from somewhere incomplete, about internal concern over unapproved partner conduct. Enough real paper to frighten a fool. Enough missing context to anger a prepared man. I scanned the first pages quickly and felt almost nothing. Not because I am cold. Because once you have carried truth long enough, a partial lie stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like bad editing. I set the documents down. Then I asked the only question worth asking before demands begin. "What do you want?" Conrad answered immediately. He had rehearsed this part. A formal acknowledgement that Peter Wren was wronged. A financial settlement, number specified in the back packet. Your resignation from any active strategic role at Rowan Freight. And a written undertaking that my son's position, compensation, and future advancement are not contingent on silence around this history. There it was, the money, the power, the son. Not grief, not healing. Terms. I asked, how much? He named a number large enough to insult me and not large enough to impress me. $85 million. Vivian did not flinch when he said it. Interesting. They had practiced. I looked down at the page, then back up. I said, "That is a surprisingly specific fantasy." Conrad leaned forward. "It reflects the present value of what Peter built and lost, adjusted for the scale of the company his work helped create. There is a point in any extortion attempt where the number itself becomes comic, not because the money is imaginary, because the story required to justify it has left the building." I asked, and my resignation. He said, "You stay on ceremonially if you like. Founder, legacy presence, whatever language flatters you. But you step away from active influence. Gabriel should not be required to operate under a man who built his position on that kind of damage." That was the moment he showed me his full shape. It was not enough to rewrite Peter. He wanted proximity to the company. Access. Insulation for his son. Leverage through governance language. Conrad had spent more time studying my structure than grief alone could explain. I said, "Do you imagine I hand you $85 million and a strategic exit because your late brother-in-law kept selective paper and you arrived hungry?" He corrected me immediately. "Brother, not brother-in-law. Brother, my mistake. Better." The blood ran straight through him after all. Gabriel spoke again, this time to me. He said, "Walter, did any of what he just said happen the way he thinks it did?" The room turned toward me whether anyone wanted it to or not. I looked at Gabriel for a long second before answering, because I wanted him to understand the difference between a quick denial and a careful truth. I said, Parts of it are real enough to explain the myth. Not one important moral conclusion in it belongs to reality. He held my eyes. I watched him absorb that. Not because he trusted me blindly. Because he was smart enough to hear the weight of a sentence that does not overclaim. Conrad cut in. That is very polished, Walter. I said no. Polished would be telling you this is a tragic misunderstanding between families. It is not. It is a dead man's selective confession grown mold in the dark. Vivian inhaled sharply at that. Social disapproval. Good. Let it work. Conrad's voice dropped a shade. Be careful. I smiled then. Not warmly. Honestly. Conrad, I said, you invited me to a private room, put a ransom note in front of me, named my daughter, named my company, named my role, and named a price. You do not get to preserve etiquette after that. Etiquette was the thing you traded in for leverage somewhere between the appetizer and the wine list. He stared at me. Then he said, if you think this is leverage, imagine what happens when those documents become public. That is the line. Always. When men like Conrad stop pretending this is about healing, they reach for publicity because publicity feels like force to people who have never managed an actual disaster. I nodded once. There it is. Gabriel turned slowly toward his father. He said, public. Conrad said nothing. Gabriel tried again. Are you threatening to go public with something you have not even let me read? Vivian said, sweetheart, the point is to avoid that if Mr. Rowan is reasonable. Mr. Rowan again. Whenever warmth retreats too quickly, watch the names. Gabriel looked at her, then at me, then back at the envelope. His face had changed. Less confusion now. More offense. Better still. He said, you brought me here as insulation. Conrad snapped. I brought you here because your future is in the middle of this. Gabriel answered, no. You brought me here so that if this turned ugly, you could tell yourself you were protecting me while using me. There are few pleasures in life cleaner than being proven right about a man's son in front of the father. I kept my face neutral. Mostly. Conrad realized he was losing clean control of the room, so he pushed harder. He said, Gabriel, you are too close to this. That man controls your title, your income, and now your marriage. Of course he wants to make this look like resentment and myth. He has had 31 years to improve his narrative. I let that sit there. Then I said, you know what I find interesting, Conrad? He did not answer. I continued. You did not ask for apology alone. You did not ask for a joint review. You did not ask for the actual records. You came in with a number, a governance demand, and language around Gabriel's future employment. Which means one of two things. Either your grief got a finance degree somewhere along the way, or this was never really about Peter first. Vivian said, that is unfair. I turned to her. Is it? She looked down. That tiny motion told me more than any of her sentences had. The waiter knocked lightly then, some poor man trying to advance civilization with plates. Conrad did not take his eyes off me when he said, not now. The waiter vanished. I looked back at the envelope, lifted one page and said, these copies are incomplete. Conrad said, they are sufficient. I said, no, they are selected. He leaned back slightly, then maybe you should tell your version. I said, I am going to. But before I do, I want one answer from Gabriel. He looked at me immediately. I asked, how much of this did you know before tonight? His answer came slower than the truth, but cleaner than any lie I would have tolerated. I knew there was family history. I knew my father believed my uncle was forced out of a business by someone ruthless. I knew Peter blamed you until he died. I did not know there would be a number on the table tonight. I did not know there would be threats around my job. And I did not know my engagement was apparently being used as seating arrangement for this. Fair, honest, enough. I nodded once. Then I turned back to Conrad and said, all right, we can do history. I placed my own envelope on the table, smaller, white, unremarkable. I have always preferred plain objects to carry sharp truths. People relax around things that do not look theatrical. Conrad's eyes dropped to it immediately. I said, your brother was not pushed out of a healthy partnership over a bookkeeping dispute. He was confronted with evidence of tax manipulation, diverted customer payments, shadow billing, and maintenance fraud linked to a crash that took part of another man's leg. He was given a choice between prison and disappearance. He chose disappearance. What he told you after that was grief management, not truth. Nobody moved. Conrad's face did not collapse. People romanticize collapse. Real collapse is slower. What happened in his features was that certainty met resistance it had not budgeted for. He said, that is convenient. I opened my envelope, removed the first set of copies, and slid them across. Then let us inconvenience each other with paper. He did not touch them, so I named them. Vendor registration for a maintenance company formed under your sister-in-law's maiden name and used to invoice Peter's approvals. Service deferral logs tied to Unit 18. Affidavit from Dale Haney, driver in the Dayton crash. Archival summary from Irene Voss, controller at the time. Partner dissolution record signed by Peter after being shown those files. Gabriel looked from me to the papers, then to his father. Conrad said, anybody can create a story around old records. I nodded, true, which is why I prefer records with bodies attached. Dale Haney is still alive. He signed that affidavit yesterday in my kitchen and brought me tomatoes because old men in Kentucky cannot handle legal matters without produce. Irene Voss is alive too. She remembers numbers better than I. Imagine you remember your own excuses. I can have both of them under oath before Monday if you would like to turn dinner into process. Vivian looked at Conrad then. Really looked. Not supportive wife to a grieved husband. Woman checking whether the ladder under her social climb was suddenly missing rungs. Conrad did not touch my papers. That was revealing in itself. Instead he said, "Peter told us you threatened him." I answered, "Yes, I did." The room changed on that sentence because people expect total innocence or total guilt. Truth is usually more irritating. I continued. I threatened to expose him for the things I had documented if he did not sign out and disappear. That is correct. What he omitted when he told you the story was why the threat existed and what I chose not to do with it. If I had done what the law allowed, your brother would have been charged publicly, sued civilly, and maybe buried under the Dayton liability alone. Gabriel spoke quietly. Dayton. I looked at him. Your father never told you about the crash. He turned to Conrad. His face no longer had softness in it. Did he? Conrad said. Peter said there was an accident in the business after things had already gone bad. I almost admired the persistence of family myth. Nearly. I said no. The accident was part of what made things go bad. Your uncle had been deferring maintenance through a shell vendor he controlled. One of those trailers failed. A driver named Dale Haney lost part of his leg. That was not bookkeeping. That was a man's body used as float on your uncle's private theft. Nobody in that room could move around that sentence cleanly. Vivian set her glass down too fast. Gabriel looked at the table, then at my documents, then back at his father with the dawning expression of a man hearing the first honest version of his own inheritance. Conrad tried one last path of moral simplification. Even if Peter did wrong, Walter, you built an empire from his ruin. That is a seductive line. It sounds almost profound if you do not know how companies survive betrayal. I said no. I built an empire after financing the cleanup of his ruin, refinancing his mess, losing my first house, and spending 3 years trying to convince customers we were not a criminal enterprise disguised as a regional hauler. Peter did not gift me a platform. He handed me a fire and left. The fact that I survived it has offended men like you for decades because survival looks like theft if you need your martyr to stay pure. Gabriel had gone still. Very still. That kind of stillness is not passive. It is structural. I knew then the second half of the dinner could begin. There is a moment in certain conversations when argument stops being the central event and orientation becomes the real issue. You are no longer fighting over what happened. You are watching people realize where they actually are. That was the room now. Conrad had come in believing he possessed a weapon. He still had paper, but the paper had changed category. A selected historical file can feel powerful right up until someone lays down the omitted pages and introduces the living witness your story quietly stepped over. Gabriel looked at my envelope again. Then he asked me a question, so direct I liked him even more for asking it in front of his father. How long have you been expecting this? I could have softened it. I did not. Since Annie told me Peter's name, since you told me your parents had become interested in my active role, since your father started asking whether I still sign major debt personally and whether Annie has separate counsel. Somewhere in there it stopped looking like unresolved family feeling and started looking like a man inventorying leverage. Vivian said, "That is offensive." I turned to her. "Only if it is untrue." She opened her mouth, closed it, and let the silence do the rest. Conrad tried to recover control through contempt. Common move. Men whose certainty has been punctured often reach for tone because substance has started slipping. He said, "You sound very pleased with yourself." I said, "Not pleased. Prepared. There is a difference. One is vanity. The other is a response." Then I shifted toward Gabriel fully, because by then the most important thing in the room was no longer Conrad's story. It was whether his son would anchor himself in truth fast enough not to be dragged by inherited fiction. I said, "Gabriel, I need you to listen carefully for the next 2 minutes because what I am about to tell you is going to rearrange several things at once and none of them deserve to land halfway." He said, "All right." I picked up my glass, took a sip, set it down, and continued. "The executive search firm that recruited you last year was contracted by me." He frowned slightly. I went on. "The board panel you interviewed with included people I selected. The compensation package you negotiated was approved by me. The operating role you accepted, the one that moved you from Indianapolis into one of the most important divisions in this company, exists inside a business I own entirely. You have not spent the last 11 months reporting into a distant corporate structure with a founder in the background. You have spent the last 11 months running one of my operating groups. If you have never watched a competent man receive information that invalidates several assumptions at once, it is a fascinating thing." Gabriel did not shout. He did not flinch theatrically. He simply sat back in his chair, looked at me as though the room had dropped half an inch without warning, and went very quiet. Conrad stared too, though for different reasons. Vivian actually whispered, "What?" I did not give anyone time to recover. I said, "As far as you knew, Gabriel, you had been identified on merit. That part remains true. Your numbers were strong. Your judgment has been stronger. I did not hand you a title because you were dating my daughter. I created a process rigorous enough to justify the title if you earned it. You did. What I kept to myself was my personal involvement in opening the door." Gabriel finally spoke. "Why?" There was no accusation in it, just genuine disorientation. I answered honestly, "Because you were serious about Annie. Because I wanted to know what kind of man you were under real pressure. Because I trusted my read on your talent enough to test it where it would matter. And because, if you are going to build a life near my daughter, I prefer to know how you behave when the stakes become professional instead of charming." Vivian made a sound that lived somewhere between a gasp and an objection. "So he has been under scrutiny from you this whole time." I looked at her. "Mrs. Wren, every senior operator in my company is under scrutiny all the time. That is called management. The fact that I happen to care whether yours could also become family does not make the process less real. It makes me a father." Conrad leaned back slowly. He said, "You placed my son inside your company without telling him who you were to it." I smiled once. "No. I recruited a capable executive into my company without foregrounding the ownership details, because founders who insist on starring in every hiring process eventually become the kind of men everyone resents behind polished language. Your son took a real job, did real work, and has been very good at it. I am sorry if that reality is less useful to your dinner plan than a theory of manipulation." Gabriel ran one hand over his mouth, then through his hair. A man buying time without wanting it to look like panic. He asked, "Annie knew?" I answered, "Yes." He closed his eyes for half a second. Then he asked, "And you were both just going to tell me eventually?" That one hurt, because the answer was more complicated than I liked. I said, "Yes, but not like this." He laughed once. No humor in it. "Of course not like this. Fair." So I told him the part that mattered most. "If it helps, I was waiting until I knew whether you were the kind of man who could hold power without performing it. That answer turned in your favor months ago." He looked at me then. Really looked. That sentence reached him because it was not flattery. It was evaluation. Men who work hard know the difference. Conrad, meanwhile, had found a new angle. He said, "This proves exactly what I suspected. You orchestrate people." That is a lazy accusation often made by men upset that someone else remembered to prepare. I said, "No. I structure risk. You came here tonight assuming your son's position could be made hostage to your story. It cannot. You assumed your son had married into access he did not understand. In that, at least, you were accidentally correct. What you did not understand is who controls the access." I removed the final document from my envelope and placed it in front of Conrad first, not Gabriel. This was not because Conrad deserved priority. It was because I wanted him to read it before his son heard me say it. He glanced down, then his face lost color. Tiny change. Satisfying one. Vivian leaned in toward the page without touching it. I said, "Annie is the controlling beneficiary of the Rowan Family Trust and already holds the future majority governance rights attached to Rowan Holdings. In simple English, because nobody at this table needs more euphemism, my daughter is already the structure your son would eventually be marrying near. Not into. Near. There is a difference. A very expensive one." Gabriel stared at me. Vivian looked at Annie's name on the page and then at me as if the room had betrayed her socially. Conrad said nothing for a full 5 seconds. Those 5 seconds brought me more pleasure than they should have. Then he said, "So your daughter already controls what comes after you?" I nodded. "Yes, and my son runs one division in a company that will one day answer partly to her, unless merit moves him higher before that, which it might." Conrad's jaw tightened. "You are telling me my son has spent the last year building the future wealth of the man who destroyed my brother and the daughter of that man?" There are few sentences that expose a father's priorities more clearly. "Not my son has been lied to. Not my son has been used. My son has been building someone else's wealth." Gabriel heard it too. He turned toward Conrad slowly, like a man handling his own disappointment with both hands. He said, "Is that really what you heard?" Conrad blinked once, too slow. Gabriel continued, "Not that you brought me to a blackmail dinner, not that you used Annie as context, not that you failed to tell me the actual allegations about Peter might involve fraud and a crash. What you heard is that I have spent a year helping the wrong people." Vivian tried to patch it. "Gabriel, that is not fair to your father. He did not even look at her." He said no. Fair to him would have been warning him before he started speaking. There are moments when parents discover their adult child no longer experiences them as moral climate. It unsettles them at a cellular level. I watched it happen in real time. Conrad reached for authority and found less of it than usual. He said, "You do not know enough yet." Gabriel answered, "Then help me." "Did you know what Peter had done with the maintenance logs?" No answer. "Did you know about Dale Haney?" Conrad's eyes moved briefly toward me. That move alone was answer enough. Gabriel asked again, quieter this time, harder because of it. Did you know? Finally, Conrad said. I knew there had been some kind of accident attached to the business. Gabriel laughed, not kindly, attached to the business. I almost felt sorry for Conrad then. Almost. Because there is no uglier mirror for a father than hearing his own euphemisms played back to him by a son who suddenly understands what they cost. Gabriel leaned forward. Did you ever ask what happened to the driver? Vivian said, darling, people tell family stories through pain. Of course some parts get distorted. He turned to her. Distorted is forgetting where Christmas was. Distorted is remembering who insulted who at a wedding. This is not distortion. This is you both, sitting me in a private room with my future father-in-law and demanding $85 million based on a dead man's version of events you did not bother verifying against a living victim. Vivian went still. Conrad said, you are being naive. Wrong answer. Gabriel sat back in his chair. No, he said. Naive was me thinking this was dinner. Then he turned to me and asked the question I had been waiting for. Do you trust me? I know what you are thinking. Of course I trusted him. I had recruited him, evaluated him, watched him save us money and tell hard truths. But trust is not a sentimental blanket you drape over a person because the plot would like it. Trust is specific. So I answered specifically. 6 months ago you stopped the Tennessee expansion because the numbers were vanity. 4 months ago you replaced a weak warehouse manager, even though he had allies on the board. 3 months ago you took responsibility for a spoilage spike in Knoxville that began before your arrival, because the customer needed one accountable face more than they needed a lecture on timeline. Last week you told your father nothing useful when he started poking around Annie's family structures, so yes, I trust you. He held my gaze. Then he asked, do you trust me after tonight? I considered that one longer. Not because I doubted him. Because I wanted to show him what a serious answer looks like. I said, I trust that you did not build tonight. I trust that you have been walking into it more slowly than you realized. And I trust the fact that you are offended by what your parents have done more than I would trust any clean denial delivered too quickly. That is enough for tonight. Monday morning we will earn the rest on purpose. Something in his face loosened. Not relief exactly. More like a man discovering there is still a floor where he expected only collapse. Conrad heard enough. He said, this is absurd. You are treating my son like some prized operator whose integrity you get to grade while you sit on top of a fortune that should have included my brother. I looked at him. No, Conrad, I am treating your son like an adult because unlike you, I do not need him blurred into dead men's claims to make my case sound larger. Then I did something I had not planned to do before entering the restaurant. But some truths deserve cleaner air once the room is already broken. I said, I'm not going to pursue you criminally for what happened tonight. Conrad actually laughed then. You are generous. I shook my head. No, I am strategic. If I pursue you, you become what grievance men always want to become when facts turn against them. Martyrs, targets, proof that the larger machine finally came for them. I have no interest in giving you that kind of shape. You arrived with a selected file, an extortion number, and the belief that your son's career and marriage could pad the edges. I prefer a less expensive outcome. Vivian asked, which is? I answered without taking my eyes off Conrad. You leave here understanding 3 things. First, Peter lied by omission and built your family mythology on what he could not survive admitting. Second, your son's future at Rowan Freight rises or falls on his own merit and not on whatever family pressure you imagined you could apply through Annie. Third, if you ever attempt to use my daughter, my trust structures, or public rumor as leverage again, I will stop being strategic and start being thorough. The waiter chose that exact moment to reappear with the main course. Bless him. There are men in this world who can carry a tray of plated food into a collapsing family war and still ask, with commendable professionalism, where the salmon should go. None of us answered. He looked from face to face, set everything down in approximate silence, murmured that he would return for anything else we needed, and vanished again. I made a note to tip him enough to support a hobby. The food sat there steaming while nobody touched it. Then Gabriel asked the hardest question yet. He directed it to Conrad. When did you know who Walter was? Conrad answered too slowly. When you told me the company name last year, I suspected. When Annie's last name lined up with Columbus, I knew. Gabriel's face did not change much, but the change that did occur was permanent. He said, so before I proposed to Annie. Conrad did not answer. Before I took the role. Nothing. Before you sat in our house and asked me how serious I was about her. Vivian said Gabriel. He looked at her once and the force of it surprised even me. No, you do not get to soften this. Then he turned back to his father. You knew all that and still let me move forward without telling me you thought the founder of the company I was joining had destroyed our family. Conrad finally said, I wanted to be sure. Gabriel asked, sure of what? Conrad made the second fatal mistake of the night. People make one under pressure. The unlucky make 2. He told the truth with the wrong audience in the room, sure whether proximity would finally let us correct what was done. There it was, not concern, not timing, not protection. proximity, access, Annie, the job, the company, the dinner, all infrastructure for a correction he had been dreaming about long before the ring. Gabriel stared at him. Then he said, "You positioned me." No one answered. He looked from his father to his mother, then back again. "You let me build a relationship, take a role, plan a future, and you were sitting there deciding when it became useful enough to cash in." Vivian reached for his hand. "Sweetheart, that is such a crude way to put it." He pulled his hand away. "Crude is using Annie's life and calling it family duty." I kept still, very still. Because when somebody finally sees their parents clearly, the worst thing you can do is rush in and make the moment about your own righteousness. Let the truth finish its work before you decorate it. Conrad tried the old paternal angle then. "Everything I did was for this family." Gabriel said, "Which family?" The question landed like a dropped wrench. Conrad blinked. Gabriel went on, "Mine, or Peter's memory, because I do not think they are the same thing to you anymore." No answer. He nodded slowly to himself, like a man confirming what he already hates. Then he asked one last thing. "Did you ever intend to tell me the whole story if tonight worked?" Conrad looked at the table. Vivian said, "Of course." Gabriel did not even glance at her. He said, "I asked him." Finally, Conrad spoke. "I intended to tell you enough. There are few phrases more dangerous than that one." Enough for what? Enough to justify, enough to control, enough to hold a son inside the frame a father prefers. Gabriel sat back and looked suddenly older than he had when we walked in. Not by years, by innocence. I knew then exactly what the real revenge would be. It would not be the money I refused to pay. It would not be the legal action I could take and chose not to. It would not even be the documents. It would be this. Conrad Wren had spent 3 decades preserving a story so carefully that it became moral architecture in his own house. Tonight he had brought that architecture into a room thinking it would shelter him. Instead, his son was the one looking up and seeing daylight through the beams. That kind of collapse cannot be sued into existence. It has to be witnessed. The remarkable thing about rooms like that is how ordinary objects continue trying to perform their jobs while human beings disintegrate politely around them. My steak cooled. Vivian's fish sat untouched. A candle near the center of the table burned with the complete emotional indifference of wax. Somewhere beyond the closed door, silverware moved, people laughed, and another table likely celebrated an anniversary without extortion. Inside our room, silence had become too expensive to waste. Conrad recovered first, or at least moved first. Recovery would be too generous a word. He picked up his wine glass, realized his hand was not as steady as he wanted it to be, set the glass back down, and chose hauteur because it was the only remaining suit in his closet that still buttoned. He said, "This has gotten theatrical." I cut into my steak. I chewed, swallowed, wiped my mouth with the napkin, and said, "No." Theatrical was the envelope. This is just weather after bad architecture. He hated that. Vivian hated even more that I was eating. People preparing an ambush always want appetite to die on contact. It offends them when the target keeps his metabolism. Gabriel looked down at his plate the way a man sometimes does when he is trying to prevent his face from showing the wrong thing too soon. Then, very calmly, he set his napkin beside his fork. Not on his lap. Not under the plate, beside the fork. Tiny gesture, large meaning. He said, "I need a straight answer from both of you before anyone leaves this table." Conrad started to speak. Gabriel held up one hand without looking at him. That hand stopped the room harder than raised voices ever could have. He said, "If I had not been engaged to Annie, if I had not accepted the role at Rowan, if I had stayed in Indianapolis doing exactly what I was doing before, would this dinner still be happening tonight?" Neither parent answered. He looked at Vivian first. She opened her mouth and gave him the look mothers use when they want time to rethread emotion into a usable rope. He did not allow it. Then he looked at Conrad. And that, in the end, was the whole trial. Not mine, not Peter's, Conrad's. A father under direct moral question from the son he expected to deploy as atmosphere. Conrad said, eventually, yes. Gabriel held his eyes. "That is not what I asked." Conrad's jaw flexed. He said, "Maybe not tonight." There it was. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, the way elegant women do when the wrong truth arrives without table manners. Gabriel nodded once, very small. Then he said, "So the engagement and the job accelerated your courage." Conrad tried to straighten the sentence. "They accelerated the need for clarity." Gabriel actually smiled then, but not with humor. "No," he said. "They accelerated your leverage. There is a difference. One word belongs to men, the other belongs to crowbars." I set my fork down and sat back. I had reached the point where any further victory would need to belong to Gabriel or it would not count correctly. Conrad, for reasons only vanity can explain, decided this was still salvageable if he simply pushed harder. He said, "You are acting as if Walter has done you some noble service. He withheld what he was to this company. He put you inside a structure you did not understand. He tested you without saying so. Do not confuse his preparation with innocence." Fair line, actually. Better than most men manage when their strategy is bleeding out on linen. Gabriel turned slowly toward me, and because he is not a fool, he asked it. Did you keep your role hidden from me because you wanted control? That is the kind of question that can either deepen trust or split it cleanly. If you answer defensively, you are done. If you answer like a saint, you are lying. So I answered like a man who has run an empire and buried a wife and knows there is no profit left in pretending to be simpler than he is. I said partly. I wanted clean data. If you knew you were dating the founder's daughter and interviewing into his company, every room would have tilted around that knowledge. People would have managed you differently. You would have managed yourself differently. I wanted to know what you were when the incentives were real and the spotlight was not. That was the strategic part. The personal part is less flattering. I also did not know yet how much of your family I might one day have to manage if you and Annie became serious. Tonight, unfortunately, answered that faster than I hoped. He absorbed it. Then he asked, and if I had been mediocre, I said, you would have been Annie's problem romantically and not mine professionally. That got the smallest involuntary sound out of him. Not quite a laugh. Enough. Then I said the part I wanted heard most clearly. But you were not mediocre. You were better than I expected. Better than some men I have paid for years. Which is why tonight matters to me for a reason bigger than old grievance. I need to know whether the man I was prepared to trust upward is also the man who can stand in this room and refuse inherited nonsense when it costs him something. Conrad said, inherited nonsense. I turned to him. Yes, that is the phrase we are using. Gabriel took one breath and made his decision. You did not need to announce it. I could see it move across his face. People call that moment resolve. Often, it is simpler than that. It is just the body choosing which pain it would rather live with. The pain of betraying your parents, or the pain of betraying yourself in front of a man you now know has seen you more clearly than you realized. He chose correctly. He looked at Conrad and Vivian and said, I am going to make this very easy. There will be no public accusation from my name. There will be no demand carried through me. There will be no conversation with Annie that frames this as some brave act of family correction. If you have actual facts I have not seen, you can send them to counsel. If what you have is the envelope in front of Walter and whatever grief story you have repeated at home for 30 years, then tonight ends here, and whatever comes after is on you, not me. Vivian said, Gabriel, do not do this in anger. He turned to her. I am not angry. That would be easier for you. I am disappointed, which is worse. She looked as though someone had turned a mirror toward her at poor lighting. Conrad tried once more. You are choosing them. That sentence nearly made me interrupt, but Gabriel beat me to it. No, he said, I am choosing truth over convenience. If that feels like them to you, maybe you should spend some time with the sentence instead of me. That was the point where even I allowed myself a little satisfaction. Not triumph, something cleaner. Years ago, when Annie was 13 and came home furious because a teacher had favored a louder child in some school leadership thing, Helen told her at our dinner table, never confuse volume with moral ownership of the room. The person who can hold still and keep naming what is true usually wins in the long run. Annie had rolled her eyes at the time because 13-year-olds are genetically required to greet wisdom as if it were a tax. Tonight, across from me, a man she loved was doing exactly what Helen meant. Conrad looked smaller suddenly, not physically, structurally. He had built the evening around the assumption that Gabriel would either lend him silence or, at minimum, refuse to oppose him in public. When sons stop providing both, fathers who rely on inherited obedience become strangely ordinary. He said, so that is it. 31 years and you walk away because he had a cleaner folder. Gabriel shook his head, no. 31 years and I walk away because you did not come here wanting truth. You came here wanting advantage and called it memory. That is a line I would have stolen if it had belonged to me. Instead, I reached for my glass and said, since we are finally speaking clearly, let me add one thing. Everybody looked at me again. Good, I said, Conrad, I am not resigning from anything because you attached your brother's omissions to a settlement figure. I am not writing a check so you can rebrand extortion as restitution. And I am not restructuring my daughter's future because you misread your own son's presence in this room as leverage you could spend. I let that sit. Then I added the sentence that would stay with him longest. The only reason your family still stands anywhere near the future of this company is that your son, in the last 40 minutes, has shown me he is not built out of the same material as you or Peter. Conrad stared at me. Vivian went pale in a more expensive way than most people manage. Gabriel's eyes shifted just slightly. There are times when a man hears a door open and does not yet know whether to step through it. This was one. I continued, not because I enjoyed it, but because clarity deserves completion. You came here tonight imagining you could threaten me with old paper and then protect Gabriel with settlement language. What you did not understand is that Gabriel never needed your protection from me. The danger in this room was always the story you put him inside before he even sat down. Silence again. Then Vivian whispered, "This is cruel." I looked at her and felt almost nothing. No. Cruel was allowing your son to get engaged to my daughter and take a leadership role in my company, while you and your husband quietly compared timelines against a dead man's grievance and waited for the point of maximum pressure. What this is, Vivian, is naming. She looked down at her plate. Conrad did not. He still had one move left and knew it. He said, "If I walk out of here, you understand this is not finished." I nodded once. "Then send it to lawyers, not my daughter. Send it with full records, not dinner paper. Send it where lies have to survive timestamps and signatures. See what remains." He held my gaze for several seconds. Then something in him made the decision I had expected from the beginning. He reached for the cream envelope, stopped when I put 2 fingers on it first. I said, "No, that stays with me." He said, "Those are copies." I answered, "Good. Then you lose nothing except access to the choreography." That landed too. He stood. Vivian followed a second later, not because she was ready, but because women like Vivian are trained to move in tandem when the social version of the marriage is under threat. She looked toward Gabriel with wet eyes. I almost believed the wetness. Almost. But then I remembered how quickly her warmth had changed names when money came up. She said, "Sweetheart, we should talk tomorrow when everybody has slept." Gabriel remained seated. He said, "Not tomorrow. Not for a while." The distance in that sentence was remarkable. You could have driven a semi through it. Conrad looked at him and I saw, finally, the father beneath the grievance. Not noble. Human. Shocked, perhaps for the first time in years, that his son could prefer the discomfort of truth to the loyalty of repetition. He said, "Son," Gabriel answered without heat. "I am still your son. That is what makes this so ugly." Conrad had nothing left that would not further damage him, so he did the only thing men like him can still do when the room is gone. He turned away. They left without another word. The door closed, and the silence that followed was one of the best purchases I have ever made without spending a dime. I sat for a moment and watched the candle burn down by another fraction. Then I looked at Gabriel. He was still staring at the closed door. I said, "You know, if we are going to salvage any civilized tradition from this evening, one of us should probably eat the potatoes." That got him. Not much, not joy, but the first honest sound of relief he had made all night. He leaned back, pressed thumb and forefinger to his eyes once, and said, "I cannot decide whether that was the worst dinner of my life or a very strong argument against private rooms." I said, "Both can be true." He nodded slowly. Then he asked, "Can I see the rest of your file?" I pushed the envelope across to him. "Take your time." He read for 15 minutes while the food died elegantly between us. I let him. Every so often he would stop, go back a page, reread something, and then look nowhere in particular as the shape of his inheritance changed again. Dale's affidavit hit him hard. Irene's notes did too. But the maintenance log on Unit 18 was the one that altered him visibly. I could see him tracing the service holds with his eyes and understanding, in a new and more adult way, the cost of the omissions that made his father's grief story feel cleaner at home. At last he set the papers down. He said, "My entire life, Peter was the sad genius uncle who got cheated by the hard partner." That was the household version. A cautionary story about how sharp men use institutions to crush more decent men. My father told it like moral weather, just part of what was true. And now I am sitting here reading maintenance fraud tied to a driver who lost his leg and tax holds, and a shell vendor, and I do not even know where to begin sorting what that does to a person. I said, "You begin by not hurrying. Fast moral repair usually turns into another lie." He looked at me. That sounds like something Helen would have said. I blinked, then smiled despite myself. "You know," I said, "Annie says I quote her mother even when I believe I am being original." He said, "She is right, probably." He picked up the page on Annie's trust position again. Then he asked, "Does Annie know all of this?" "Not yet. She knows enough to be worried and annoyed. She does not know the old file, and she does not know I told you this way tonight." He nodded. "She is going to be furious. Yes, at both of us. Almost certainly." He let out one breath that contained more fatigue than sound. Then he looked at his phone. I knew what he was seeing there without needing to ask. Annie. Waiting. Counting. Trying not to turn 20 quiet minutes into catastrophic fiction. I took mine out and sent the promised message. Sitting. Alive. Language has already become disappointing. We'll explain soon. Less than 10 seconds later, Annie replied, "If anyone says legacy wound, I'm setting something on fire." I showed Gabriel the screen. For the first time that night, he smiled properly. He said, "I'm going to marry above my emotional station forever, aren't I?" I said, "Yes. Best get used to it." Then the waiter returned, heroic man that he was, and asked if anyone would care for dessert. Gabriel looked at me. I looked at him, and because I refused to let bad men own an evening entirely, I said, "What is the chocolate thing?" The waiter, with the dignity of a diplomat serving civilians, said, "Flourless torte with espresso cream." I said, "Two." Gabriel said, "Also coffee." The waiter nodded as if none of this had been unusual and disappeared again. When he was gone, Gabriel said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "No. You owe me honesty on Monday morning and good judgment until then. Apologies are decorative if the structure under them is already sound." He considered that. then nodded. Fair. After a few minutes, he asked the question that mattered more than the envelope, the money, or even Peter. Are you still willing to let me stay in my role? There are questions men ask when they want reassurance, and questions they ask when they want to know who they are, now required to become. That was the second kind. So again, I answered specifically, you are staying in your role because you earned it before tonight, and because tonight you refused the easiest disloyalty available to you. But understand me, Monday morning is not business as usual. We are going to have a full conversation. Not founder and division president, not father of the bride and shocked fiancé, two men, about what trust means now, what Annie deserves, and what boundaries exist between your family and ours until you decide what shape they still have at all. He said, that sounds fair. It is more than fair, I said. It is me choosing not to make your parents' failure your professional biography. His face changed at that, subtly, but enough. Then he said, thank you. I shook my head. Do not thank me yet. You still have to survive, Annie. That actually made him laugh. Dessert arrived, the torte was excellent. The coffee was real. I tipped the waiter enough to finance whatever story he later told in the service corridor. We stood outside Hawthorne House at 9:43 in the cold. The valet had already pulled my truck around because, unlike some fathers, I do not believe in testing people's loyalty by making them freeze on a curb. Gabriel stood with both hands in his coat pockets and looked much more like a man leaving a funeral than a dinner. Streetlight on one side of his face. Breath visible. The entire expensive club warm behind him and useless. He said, I do not know what tonight makes me. I leaned against the truck and looked at him for a second before answering. It makes you a man whose parents used him and who found out in time not to cooperate. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I also do not know what Annie will think of the part you and I played without telling her. That one was fair too, I said. She will hate the omission. She may also hate that the two of us protected each other structurally without inviting her into the forecast. She will not be wrong. He asked, then why did you do it? Because I said, I was trying to keep the weapon from reaching her before I understood its shape. Fathers overestimate their right to do that all the time. Sometimes we are right. Sometimes we are just controlling with better intentions. I am still sorting which version tonight was. He gave that a half smile. That sounds exhausting. It is. He looked back toward the club, then down the dark drive. Then he said, I am not speaking to them tonight. I said, good. Nobody should attempt moral reconstruction in a parking lot after flowerless torte. He nodded, then surprised me with the next line. I think I always knew something in my father's stories arrived too ready. I just did not want the work of pulling at it because then I would owe the truth a place to go. That is one of the smartest things anyone said in the whole affair. I told him so. Then I got in the truck, drove toward Ashford, and spent most of the highway thinking two simultaneous thoughts. First, Helen would have loathed the menu and admired the outcome. Second, the real work had only just begun. Annie was waiting at my house with all the composure of a person who had spent 2 hours trying not to turn her imagination into breaking news. She had changed into sweatpants and one of Helen's old cardigans, which meant she had reached the stage of emotional preparedness where comfort was no longer optional. Murphy was draped across her feet on the living room rug like a sentry with a poor work ethic. When my headlights hit the front of the house, the curtain moved before I even parked. I walked in with Gabriel 3 steps behind me because sending him home to process alone felt irresponsible, and because Annie would have burned my kitchen down if I had walked through the door without him. She stood immediately. She looked at my face first, then Gabriel's, then the envelope in my hand. That order broke my heart a little because it told me exactly how many versions of disaster she had already rehearsed. She said, everybody alive? I answered, yes. She looked at Gabriel. You? He nodded, still alive. Then she looked at the envelope again and said, all right, sit down. Nobody starts with it's complicated unless they are prepared to wear this pie. That was Helen too. Not the pie threat, the refusal to let language soften what reality had not earned. So we sat at the kitchen table. Same table where Annie had done algebra badly, where Helen once planned half a school fundraiser with 3 sharp pencils and contempt for committeemen, where I had spread Peter Wren's file 4 nights earlier like a diseased specimen. I gave Annie the short version first because shock deserves sequence. Conrad and Vivian came with selective documents. They demanded money. They demanded I step out strategically. They tried to frame Gabriel's future as something they needed to protect from me. I answered with the full file on Peter. They did not handle it well. Gabriel did. She listened without interrupting until I said $85 million, at which point she actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because some numbers are so absurd they temporarily bypass ordinary reaction and go straight to disbelief. She said, they named a price. I said yes. She looked at Gabriel. Did you know? He answered the way a man does when he has already decided honesty is the only thing in the room that cannot be negotiated. No, I knew there was old history. I did not know they would come in with a settlement number and a resignation demand. I did not know Walter had a full counterfile ready. And I did not know I was apparently part of the event design. Annie turned slowly to me. You had a counterfile ready. I said, yes. You expected this. I said, after your mother asked about Columbus through Vivian and Peter's name surfaced, yes. She sat back, inhaled once, and then reached for her water the exact way Helen used to before saying something precise enough to bruise. You let me sit here all week thinking something was wrong and did not tell me what shape it was. I answered, I did not know enough yet. She held my eyes, but you knew enough to tell Mary and not enough to tell me. That one landed because it was accurate. I said yes. Her jaw tightened. Then she said, I am trying very hard not to confuse loving you with excusing you right now. Fair again. It was a night full of fair. I said, sweetheart, you do not owe me excusing. Gabriel cut in gently. You also do not owe me any version of quick forgiveness for not telling you Walter recruited me the way he did. Her head turned so fast toward him that Murphy lifted his own in sympathy. You knew that was going to come out tonight and you still sat down. He answered, I did not know that part until he said it. I knew there was something wrong. I did not know I was about to find out my future father-in-law owns my company more directly than I understood. My father has been carrying a lie for 30 years, and your trust position apparently matters more to him than my engagement. Annie stared at him a second longer. Then she said, well, when you put it that way, your evening does sound slightly busy. That cracked it. Not the conflict, the intensity. Enough for all three of us to breathe again. I told the whole story after that. Not every operational detail, not every service log, but the real spine. Peter, Irene, Dale, the crash, the shell vendor, the confrontation in 1993, Conrad's myth, the dinner, the trust paper, the part where Gabriel chose truth in the room instead of defaulting to blood. Annie listened with both elbows on the table and one hand over her mouth by the time I got to Unit 18 and Dale's leg. When I finished, she sat there for a long time. Then she asked the question I should have known would matter most to her. Did Mom know about Peter? I said, yes. Most of it. Not every accounting detail, but enough. She knew why he left and why I never wanted his name in this house again. Annie nodded slowly. Then she asked, would she have handled this the way you did? The answer arrived before the thought did. No. Annie's mouth twitched. Not with humor, recognition. I went on. She would have told you earlier. She would have hated the secrecy more than I did. She also would have known exactly when to tell you in a way that protected you, without making it feel like protection from your own life. Your mother was better than I am at the emotional architecture around events. I was always better at the walls. Annie looked down at her hands and then back up. I miss her most on nights when everyone in the room is technically trying. That sentence hit all of us at once. Nobody spoke for a little while. Then Gabriel said, so do I, and I only had the privilege of knowing her for 15 months. Annie reached for his hand then, the first touch between them since we entered the house. That mattered to me more than any dessert course or parking lot conversation. It was not absolution, just contact. But contact is where rebuilt things start. We talked until after midnight. Boundaries. Phones. The fact that Gabriel was not calling his parents. The fact that Annie was not calling them either. The fact that Mary Finch would be looped in before sunrise. The fact that, engaged or not, nobody got to skate over the trust issue now that it had surfaced. If Gabriel was going to marry into proximity with our family structures, we were going to do the mature and deeply unromantic thing and have legal clarity before flowers or venues or menu cards. At one point, Annie said, I cannot believe I am having premarital governance conversations at my father's kitchen table. I said, sweetheart, it is the least sexy way possible to prove a relationship is real. She said, that should be on a pillow somewhere for accountants. We all laughed then, tired and uneven but honest. Gabriel left around 1:20 with the envelope copies I allowed him to take and a face that suggested sleep would not be visiting him first. After he drove off, Annie stayed at the table while I rinsed glasses. She said, you like him more now. I kept my back to her for a second because fathers should not make their daughters watch every emotion land in their shoulders. Then I turned and said, yes. She nodded. Me too. Then she looked at me in the way adult daughters do when they are about to offer you both grace and warning. Do not make the mistake of turning tonight into a reason to treat him like he belongs to you now. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was exactly the sentence Helen would have used. I said noted. She narrowed her eyes. That means nothing unless I see behavior. Again, Helen, I promised. The next morning, Mary Finch had 3 drafts on my desk by 10. First, a preservation and cease contact notice to Conrad and Vivian Wren. Polite, cold, perfect. All future communication about Peter Wren, historical claims, Annie, Gabriel, or Rowan structures to counsel only. No contact through Annie. No direct attempts to interfere with employment or family planning. Any reputational allegation to be treated as actionable in light of the incomplete materials presented and the underlying record available to rebut them. Second, A governance clarification packet for Annie and Gabriel. Not romantic, deeply necessary. What the trust is, what it is not. What marriage changes, what it never changes. Helen would have approved the thoroughness and hated the binder color. Third, an internal memo for Monday morning's meeting with Gabriel. Because yes, there was a Monday morning meeting. I met him in my Louisville office at 8 sharp. No board, no Sheila, no coffee service trying to civilize hard things. Just me, Gabriel, 2 chairs, a table, and enough window to remind both of us that business continues even when people's insides do not. He looked tired, cleaner than he probably felt. Suit on, tie absent, good. I distrust ties after family events. I handed him coffee anyway. He said thank you. I said do not mistake caffeine for mercy. That got the smallest real smile out of him. Then we began. I told him what I needed from him in 4 parts. First, full transparency if his parents tried any contact outside counsel. Second, no defensive overcorrection at work. I did not need him showing up Monday and trying to prove himself by working like he had insulted me personally. That kind of compensation is usually vanity under stress. Third, an honest answer about whether he still wanted the role now that he understood more of the structure around him. And fourth, time. Not dramatized reflection, actual time. Long enough to distinguish grief over parents from judgment about truth. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he gave me the answer I most needed. I still want the role, he said. Not because of Annie, not because leaving would make this uglier, because the work is mine now. I built changes there with my own hands, and I'm not letting my parents turn that into collateral too. Good answer. Then he said, but I also need you to know something. I waited. He continued. Part of me is furious with you, not in the same way I am furious with them, but enough that it would be dishonest to act immediately grateful or seamlessly aligned. You recruited me while holding information about your role. You let me operate inside assumptions that served your evaluation. I understand why. I also do not yet know what I feel about being right and used at the same time. There are days when I think the world would work better if more executives spoke that plainly. I nodded. That is fair, he added. I'm not saying it to punish you. I am saying it because if I do not, then we start this new version with a politeness I do not trust. And there it was, the reason I had recruited him in the first place. I said, keep speaking that way and I will probably keep paying you. He laughed. Short, tired, real. Then we spent 2 hours on the actual work of repair. Not emotional repair. Operational. That came easier to both of us. What contact channels to lock down. What information Annie should get in legal form and what she should get from us in human speech. What the board knew and did not know. Whether Sheila should be informed partially or fully. Whether Gabriel wanted time away from Indianapolis in case his parents tried to use home ground against him. By 10:30 we were no longer founder and division head standing in the smoke. We were 2 men designing a clean perimeter. Then we got to the trust. I walked him through it myself. Helen's logic, my logic, why Annie's position existed the way it did, what near meant instead of into, how marriage would interact with ordinary life and never with core control, what prenups are actually for when people stop treating them like insults. He heard all of it without offense. That impressed me. At the end he said, so the structure was built to protect Annie from marriage, you from death, and the company from panic. Yes. And now it is also protecting us from my father. Also yes. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I cannot decide whether your wife was romantic in a very practical way or practical in a very romantic way. I smiled. Both. That afternoon Annie came in too. We did not combine the meetings. Some truths need different air. She marched into my office with a folder under one arm and the kind of focus that usually means education policy is about to lose a bureaucrat. She shut the door, sat, and said, I have 2 questions and then 1 emotional complaint. I said, that is efficient. She said, thank you. I learned from a manipulative old freight man. Question 1. Did you ever intend to tell me that my trust position had moved from abstract future to actual present in terms this specific? I said yes. Before any wedding planning got real, her eyes narrowed. When? I said before deposits. She shook her head. Question 2. Are you proud of how little room you gave me to decide what risk I was carrying this week? That one stung because it should have. I said no. She looked startled. Good. Sometimes children expect parents to defend because parents usually do. She was not going to get that from me where she was right. I continued, no. I am proud of being prepared. I am not proud of how late I let you into the actual shape. I was trying to keep the danger from becoming yours too soon. That does not mean I got it right. She nodded slowly. Then she said, emotional complaint. Proceed. You and Gabriel both have a talent for making protection feel like architecture and not secrecy. Please stop. There is no reply to that better than honesty. I said, we will try. She looked at me for a second, and then, because she is my daughter and Helen's daughter and does not confuse moral victory with withholding love forever, she stood, walked around the desk, and kissed my forehead. You were good last night, she said. You were also impossible. Both things are allowed to be true. Then she left before I could answer. Monday evening, Gabriel sent one message. My parents came to the apartment building. I did not let them in. Mary has the details. Under it, after a pause, another line. Annie brought soup and a legal binder. I suspect this is commitment. I wrote back, yes. Terrifying, isn't it? He replied, more than the board. That was when I knew we had made it through the first night and into the harder, more honest part. The story was no longer about whether Conrad's myth would survive dinner. It was about what kind of family could still be built after the myth failed. If the story had ended there, it would still have been enough for dinner and family lore. But men like Conrad Wren do not lose cleanly because loss requires self-knowledge, and self-knowledge was never the operating fuel. 3 days after the dinner, Mary forwarded me an email chain. Conrad had sent selected copies from his envelope to a local business reporter in Indianapolis, one activist director he believed would be susceptible to governance panic, and a former banker who still moved in circles adjacent to several of our vendors. The subject line was almost funny in its ambition. Historical coercion involving Rowan Freight founder. Governance concerns if family succession now underway. History, coercion, governance, family succession. That man loved nouns the way some people love knives. The email itself was even better. Peter Wren wrongfully stripped of partnership, evidence suppressed through founder power, potential retaliatory use of family ties against current executive, namely Gabriel Wren, now engaged to founder's daughter. Questions about whether board oversight has been compromised. It was the kind of message designed to do two things at once. Sound serious enough to spread. Incomplete enough to survive first contact with ignorance. Mary came into my office with a copy in one hand and her reading glasses in the other. She said, I assume do not become a martyr remains the strategy. I said, it does. Unfortunately, he has become irritating enough that I would enjoy alternate options. She said, that is why nobody lets you write the first letter. Gabriel arrived 10 minutes later because Mary had already called him. He stood in the doorway, glanced at the printout, and said, he CC'd a reporter. I said, yes. He closed the door behind him and took a seat without asking. That was new. Good. Men who are finding their footing stop asking permission from the furniture first. He read the email in silence. Then he set it down and said, he is trying to turn my role into a governance crisis. I answered, yes, which means he has abandoned the myth as private grief and moved it fully into strategy. That helps us. Mary said, it also means we respond once, comprehensively, and in a way that closes the professional circuit before rumor decides it deserves oxygen. So we did. By noon that day, Mary had drafted a response packet so lethal in its restraint that I nearly applauded. To the reporter, a brief note. The records provided are materially incomplete and omit underlying fraud, maintenance diversion, and witness evidence available to rebut the narrative in full. Any publication without review of the broader file would be reckless. Further inquiries to counsel. To the activist director, a longer note. Yes, a historical dispute exists. No, the founder is not compromised. Yes, the current executive named in the email has already disclosed the attempted use of his role by family members. Yes, counsel and governance are aligned. More detailed review to be provided at a special board session. To Conrad, through counsel, a single page, you were warned. Any further selective dissemination will be treated as evidence of bad faith and handled accordingly. If your intent is truth, appear where full records are required. If your intent is leverage, stop. I signed nothing personally. Mary preferred it that way. Good. Then I made the decision that finished the story properly. I called a special board session for the following Thursday. Not because the board was in open revolt. They were not. Good directors hate surprises but love full paper. Once Mary spoke to the two who mattered most, they understood enough to stay calm. No, I called the session because secrecy was no longer doing any useful work. Conrad wanted governance concern as a vague cloud. Fine. We would give governance a room, a table, full records, and sunlight. I also invited Dale Haney. When I called, he answered by saying, if this is about public speaking, my left knee is already offended. I said, nobody is asking you to give a TED talk. I need you in a room where the truth has to be heard by people who may otherwise mistake paper for story. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, if this puts Peter's name next to what happened instead of next to what he told people happened, I will put on a decent shirt. That was Dale. No wasted heroics. I invited Sheila too. And our CFO, and Mary, obviously. And after some thought, Annie. That part was debated. Mary said, strictly speaking, Annie need not be there unless a trust matter is moving from private architecture into live governance. I said, it already has. Conrad dragged it in when he named her engagement as part of his leverage. Mary said, fair. Gabriel said, if Annie is there, I want it because she chose it, not because we decided for her again. Exactly right. So I asked Annie. She listened, asked who else would be there, and then said, if men are going to discuss my life as governance on purpose, I would love to attend and disappoint them with precision. Again, Helen. Thursday arrived clear and hard. The boardroom in Louisville is on the top floor, mostly glass, with a river view people always mention for about 6 minutes before they remember margins exist. I have never cared much for views in business rooms. Views make mediocre men feel visionary. Give me good paper and a functioning thermostat instead. Everyone was there by 9. Sheila at the side with her notebook open. Mary with the full file tabbed in 3 colors because she enjoys intimidating disorder. Our CFO, Bernard Pike, wearing the expression of a man who has not forgiven an unnecessary rumor since 1998. Annie in a dark green dress and boots, looking too much like Helen for my nerves. Gabriel at the far side of the table, composed in the way people become composed when they have had to build it deliberately over several days. And Dale Haney, in a navy button-down, artificial leg hidden under pressed slacks, cane leaning beside his chair like punctuation. That sight alone was enough to settle my thinking. Some truths do not become real enough until the body they pass through enters the room. We had 2 outside directors in person and 1 by video. The activist one Conrad had copied, a man named Randall Poole, looked faintly embarrassed before we began, which was a promising sign. Men who arrive embarrassed are easier to educate than men who arrive indignant. I opened the session myself. I said, "Thank you all for making time on short notice. Some of you received selective materials from a man named Conrad Wren this week. Those materials concern a dissolved partnership from 1993, his late brother Peter Wren, and allegations that my present role, my daughter's engagement, and Gabriel Wren's position here create governance concerns. We are meeting because I prefer complete truth to elegant rumor, and because this company deserves adults." Then I sat down. Mary took over. She walked them through the history with surgical calm. Formation years, Peter's role, emerging discrepancies, Shell maintenance vendor, tax holds, diverted customer payments. Unit 18, the Dayton crash, Dale, the confrontation, the dissolution, the post-event rebuild, the selective documents Conrad had circulated, and crucially what those documents omitted. No moral language, no rhetorical flourish, just sequence. Then she asked Dale if he would be willing to speak. He leaned forward, folded his hands, and said, "I am not here because I enjoy reliving bad years. I am here because when people tell my accident as background scenery to some family legend about a wrong partner, I take that personally. My trailer should not have been on the road. The company record at the time made it look serviced. It was not. Walter did not cost me my leg. Walter spent years trying to make sure Peter's version did not cost me the truth too. That was all he said. He did not need more." Randall Poole, to his credit, asked the right question next. When did Gabriel become aware his family might try to use him in this matter? Gabriel answered before Mary could. At dinner last Friday, in full. I had known there was old family grievance around Peter Wren. I did not know my father intended to present a demand for money, strategic resignation, or protective language around my employment. I told Walter before the dinner that my parents' questions had started feeling wrong. After the dinner, I forwarded all subsequent contact to counsel. Simple, clean, unpanicked. Bernard Pike added the operational side, Gabriel's performance, his decisions, his value, the fact that no unusual compensation structures tied him to Annie, no shadow equity, no hidden sweetheart arrangements. Just a strong executive in a real role. Then Annie spoke. I had not known until that morning exactly what she planned to say. Good. Prepared daughters are wonderful. Overmanaged daughters are dangerous to truth. She said, "Since my name has been made relevant by people who do not get to decide relevance, let me clarify mine. My engagement to Gabriel is not a merger. My trust position does not grant access through marriage. The architecture around my family's assets was built before Gabriel and I were even old enough to have a first bad kiss. It exists to protect the company, the foundation, and any future child in this family from panic, predation, and preventable confusion. If anyone outside this room imagined my personal life created a shortcut into governance, they misunderstood both me and the documents." Then she looked directly at Randall Poole and added, respectfully, "If the concern is nepotism, I would invite you to compare my work history to your nephew's consultancy invoices from last year." Bernard choked on coffee. Mary did not smile. She enjoyed herself anyway. Randall turned red enough that even video would have caught it. The room, which had begun the morning alert and slightly tense, relaxed by several measurable degrees. Because that is what full truth does in competent spaces. It may not make people comfortable, but it makes them orientable. The last part of the session belonged to me. I stood, walked to the far end of the table, and put one hand on the back of an empty chair because old habits from warehouse briefings die hard. I said, I want to be clear about what this company will not do. We will not let a selected family grievance rewrite a documented operational history. We will not treat a dead man's omissions as equal in weight to full records. We will not collapse serious governance into dinner rumor, and we will not make Gabriel Wren pay professionally for a choice his father made privately. Then I paused, because there was one more thing I had decided in the last 2 days, and this was the room for it. I said, and because unfinished harm becomes institutional if you let it, Rowan Freight and Cold Storage will establish the Dale Haney Driver Safety Fund effective immediately. Annual grants, training support, emergency assistance for injured independent and small fleet drivers in our operating region. Seeded privately by me this year. Matched by the company next year if the board approves. Dale blinked. Once, hard. I had not told him in advance. Deliberate. Some gratitude loses dignity if you script it too early. The board approved the concept before lunch. That mattered more than I let show. Not because philanthropy heals operational fraud from 30 years ago. It does not. Nothing heals a man's missing lower leg or the years built around a lie. But institutions can choose what kind of memory they operationalize. Conrad wanted Peter's memory as leverage. Fine. I would place Dale's memory in the company instead. That, though none of us said it aloud then, was the real revenge. By formalizing the truth in governance, I made Conrad's private mythology permanently too expensive for serious people to repeat. After the meeting ended, Randall Poole asked for a private word. That amused me. He said, I want the record to reflect that my concern was governance process, not belief in Mr. Wren's allegations. I said, Randall, the record reflects whatever paper and time survive you. Use both more carefully. He nodded in a chastened sort of way and left. Dale stayed behind. He stood by the window with his cane and looked down at the river for a while before saying anything. Then he said, You know, if you had told me 30 years ago that one day my leg would become a boardroom scholarship line item, I would have assumed one of us was heavily medicated. I laughed. He looked at me and added, Good work. From Dale, that was nearly a sonnet. Conrad, predictably, did not appreciate any of this. By that afternoon, he had left 2 furious voicemails with Mary and sent Gabriel 3 texts that alternated between wounded father, righteous avenger, and deeply injured man who could not believe his own son would take the side of power. Gabriel forwarded all 3 without comment. Then, around 6, he called me directly. Mary had instructed me not to take the call. I took it anyway, not because I am reckless. Because there are moments when hearing a man's voice after his failure tells you whether the story is actually over. I answered and said, You have 30 seconds before this becomes counsel's problem again. Conrad did not bother with greeting. You turned a family grievance into a board event. I said, No. You emailed a reporter and a director. I turned your mistake into governance hygiene. He was silent for a second, breathing hard enough that I could hear the shape of it. Then he said, You humiliated my brother's memory in front of strangers. I looked out my kitchen window at Annie's old swing hanging still in the dusk and thought of Dale at the board table. I said, No, Conrad. Peter humiliated his own memory. I just refused to keep paying storage fees on it. He said, You think you won. That word again, won. Men like Conrad always reveal themselves there. Everything becomes contest, because contest is easier than mourning the version of your life built on the wrong foundation. I answered carefully, No. I think your son finally saw the cost of your story. That is not winning. That is consequence. He made a sound low in his throat, half laugh, half anger. Then he said the sentence that ended whatever pity I still had. You took him from us. I said no. You brought him into a room and asked him to help hold a lie upright. He walked away from the strain himself. Then I hung up. Afterward, I stood there in my kitchen and realized my hand was shaking slightly. Not fear, residue. People think revenge feels like heat. Sometimes it feels like a cold leaving your bloodstream. That night, Gabriel came over, not planned. Annie texted first. He needs to talk, and I do not think it should be alone. He arrived carrying Thai takeout and the face of a man whose family history had spent an entire week grinding itself against reality. We ate in the kitchen, containers open, chopsticks where appropriate, forks where honest. Halfway through dinner, he looked at me and said, I keep having the same thought, and I hate it. I said, if the thought involves resigning out of guilt, save time, and hate a better one. That got a breath of laughter. Then he said, no, the thought is worse. Part of me still feels responsible for him being exposed like that publicly. And another part of me knows exposure was the first adult consequence he has probably faced in years that did not come wrapped in an audience already loyal to him. I nodded. That is because you were raised by him and are still learning which feelings are yours and which were trained into you. He looked at Annie then. She was sitting on the counter with her knees pulled up, listening the way Helen used to listen when she had already decided not to rescue the speaker from their own useful pain. Annie said, you do not owe your parents privacy for behavior they only felt safe doing in private. He stared at the table for a second. Then he said, I know, I just wish knowing came with less static. That was one of the truest lines anyone spoke in the whole aftermath. The static does lessen, by the way, but only after truth has repeated itself often enough to become boring. That weekend, Annie and Gabriel met with their own attorney about the trust, the prenup, and the difference between marriage and access. Sensible, unromantic, healthy. I paid for the first consultation without apology because some investments return peace rather than money. On Sunday afternoon, while Annie was in the garden and Gabriel was on the porch with Murphy snoring against his leg, I took a call from Dale. He said, I have been thinking. That phrase is never safe from men like Dale. I said, should I sit down? You already are, he said. Listen, That fund. If you are serious, I said I am. Then make Gabriel help build it. I was quiet. Dale continued. Let the son spend some time putting the right memory where the wrong one used to be. Might do him good. Might do the fund good too. That was wiser than most board strategy decks I have seen. I said, that is a very good idea. Dale snorted. I know. That is why I called and not the other way around. When I pitched it to Gabriel later, he did not answer immediately. Then he said, yes, I would like that. And just like that, the future changed shape again. Conrad had hoped to use his son as a bridge into power. Instead, his son was about to help build a permanent institutional reminder of the truth his father had tried to suppress. That is what I mean when I say the coffee was never the real ending. Time does interesting things to shock. The first week it feels electric. The second week it becomes administrative. By the third, if the truth was real enough, it starts settling into furniture. That was the next season of our lives. Conrad and Vivian did not vanish, though part of me would have appreciated the simplicity. They became what disgraced parents often become when they are denied both full forgiveness and a clean villain. Inconsistent. One day Mary would get a message through council declaring the board session defamatory and the Haney Fund a vindictive attempt to canonize one version of a complicated business era. The next day Gabriel would receive a text from Vivian that said only, "We love you," and grief made us ugly. Grief did not make them ugly. Grief may have dressed the wound, but strategy tailored the suit. That distinction matters. It mattered to me. It mattered even more to Annie, whose tolerance for emotional imprecision is a family trait sharpened by graduate school and budget committees. The wedding planning slowed, sensibly. Nobody called it postponement because language still wanted optimism. But deposits stopped moving and weekends ceased to involve venue visits or catering spreadsheets. Instead, they involved legal meetings, long walks, quiet dinners, and the particular intimacy of learning whether the person you love can tell the truth about their parents without turning into their defense counsel by reflex. Gabriel, to his great credit, did not do that. He grieved. He doubted. He had days where his face looked 10 years older, and mornings where coffee appeared to be carrying more of his moral framework than caffeine is designed for. But he did not retreat into blood loyalty just because blood had arrived crying. Annie watched that carefully. So did I. One Saturday in late March, about 6 weeks after the dinner, the three of us were in my kitchen sorting through preliminary grant criteria for the Haney Fund. Dale wanted the first year's grants simple. Emergency recovery support for injured independent drivers, temporary family assistance, retraining stipends where possible, no grandstanding, which was Dale's phrase for any brochure with more adjectives than facts. Gabriel had built the draft criteria into something clear and practical. Annie had refined the community piece so it did not read like a board of wealthy people congratulating itself for discovering hardship exists. I had contributed seed capital and a list of 24 small fleet contacts who had no reason to trust glossy philanthropy unless someone like Dale vouched first. In other words, it was beginning to look like a real thing. Annie was leaning over the table with a pen between her teeth. Gabriel sat beside her reading line edits. I was making a second pot of coffee because my household has entered the stage of life where all serious emotional and financial progress appears to require additional grounds. My phone buzzed. Mary. I answered and said, "Please tell me somebody merely misspelled indemnification and we all get to go home." She said, "Conrad Wren is requesting a direct meeting." I looked through the kitchen doorway toward Annie and Gabriel. They were still bent over the draft, close enough that Annie's shoulder touched his. That sight alone changed the temperature in me. I said, "Through counsel." "Yes." "On what terms?" "He says he wants one final conversation without reporters, boards, daughters, or lawyers. He says there are things one man should say to another without committee witnesses." I smiled despite myself. The phrase had so much performance in it I could smell the hair product. Mary heard the silence and said, "Absolutely not is an acceptable answer." "Maybe. Walter. I know. Let me think." I hung up and stood there with the phone in my hand longer than necessary. Annie noticed first. She always does. She said, "What happened?" I walked back in and told them. Gabriel's face shut slightly. Not fear. Anticipation of disappointment. He said, "Do not go if this is just another version of him trying to reclaim the room." "Fair." Annie said, "If you go, you do not go alone." I looked at both of them and felt the odd, private satisfaction of seeing a younger generation already beginning to protect me the way I had spent decades trying to protect them. Still, I knew almost immediately that I was going to accept. Not because Conrad deserved another audience. He did not. Because some endings only feel complete if the men who began them are required to stand on the same ground one last time after truth has had time to harden. I said, "I am going, but I am choosing the place." Mary hated that when I told her. She said, "You have an almost supernatural gift for confusing closure with risk." I said, "That is why I pay you to find the difference after I have already started driving." She muttered something about old men and theatrical self-trust. Then she asked where. I told her. the old Columbus yard. To explain why that mattered, I need to tell you something I had not had reason to say yet. After the lease ended in 1998, I bought the old yard outright. Not because it made great business sense. It did not. The location had become less useful to our growing network and more expensive than I liked. But I bought it anyway because there are places that become part of your own nervous system, and selling them feels like losing not just ground but memory. For years it sat mostly dormant. Some overflow storage, an archive room, equipment training a few weeks out of the year. Nothing dramatic, nothing sentimental on the surface. Just an old piece of property with a cracked office window, patched concrete, and enough ghosts in the corners that I never took Helen there unless I had a reason. After the board meeting and the fund approval, I had started thinking about it differently. Not nostalgia, utility. It had room for a small driver safety training site, not the main fund, not a monument. I do not believe in monuments unless somebody has earned granite and not just narrative. But a training annex, yes. A place where younger drivers and small fleet mechanics could work through actual safety failure scenarios without pretending the industry teaches respect by magic. Dale liked the idea immediately when I floated it. He said, "If you put the thing in a ballroom, I am not attaching my name to it. If you put it somewhere with oil stains and bad history, now we are talking." So the morning Conrad asked for one last meeting, the old yard became my answer. He arrived at 3 on a gray Thursday wearing a coat too expensive for the wind and the expression of a man trying to look like he had chosen austerity for symbolic reasons instead of because I had denied him a nicer venue. I was already there. So was Gabriel. That part I had not told Conrad. I had thought hard about whether to include him. In the end, I decided yes for one reason. Conrad's grievance had used his son as infrastructure. The final conversation did not get to occur in a version of the world where that son was absent again. We stood near the old office building. The patched window still looked tired. One section of the yard had been cleared where we were planning the training site. Wooden stakes marked future boundaries. A temporary sign leaned against a sawhorse, still covered with canvas. Conrad saw Gabriel first. His face tightened. He said, "I asked for a conversation between men." Gabriel answered before I could, then behave like one and keep going. Well, there are times when a father loses his son in one dramatic gesture. More often he loses him in a sequence of sentences where the son finally stops using childhood grammar. Conrad heard it. So did I. He looked at me. "You brought him." I said no. He chose to come. "Another distinction you seem professionally resistant to." Conrad exhaled hard through his nose. Then he looked around the yard. "Of course you picked this place." I asked, "Do you know why it matters?" He said, "Because you are sentimental in work boots." That was not bad. If the man had been less rotten, we might have had useful arguments 30 years ago. I said, "Close, because this is where the lie began earning interest." He stared at the office. For a second, I could see him trying to overlay his brother's version onto the actual place and failing. Time does that to myth when you make people stand inside real weather. He said, "I did not come for more speeches." I nodded toward the office. "Then come for paper." We went inside. The room smelled like dust, old wood, and the particular dry cold that only unused industrial offices know how to hold. The floor still had the soft patch by the window. The desk was not the same, but close enough to make memory unhelpful. On the table were 3 things. A copy of Peter's dissolution agreement, a framed photograph of Dale Haney standing with his cane outside the Louisville boardroom last month, looking more annoyed than heroic, and the uncovered sign from the yard. Conrad saw the sign and stopped. Haney Driver Safety Annex, a Rowan Freight and Cold Storage Initiative. Founding Advisory Board, Dale Haney, Annie Rowan, Gabriel Wren. Below it, smaller. Dedicated to the truth that maintenance delayed is harm invited. Conrad looked at Gabriel so fast it almost qualified as panic. "You put his name on this." Gabriel said, "Yes. My brother's name is nowhere." I answered, "Correct." Conrad turned toward me. "That is vindictive." "No," I said. "It is accurate." He stepped closer to the sign. "Peter built this company." I felt anger then, hot and clean enough that it almost surprised me after months of colder forms. I said, "Peter helped start a business and then used it like a private line of credit until another man paid in bone. That is the only sentence of yours that ever needs to survive now. I am tired of respecting the decorative versions." Conrad's face changed. Not into insight, into hurt so old it had learned to look righteous. "You hated him." There it was. The child's question under the man's grievance. I surprised both of us with the answer. No. I hated what he made necessary. There is a difference. He stared at me. I went on because he had finally asked a real thing. I loved what we were building before I knew what he was doing to it. That is why it cost so much to end him. If he had just been a thief, I could have hated him cleanly. But he was smart and alive and useful, and he could make a yard feel like momentum. Then he put bad equipment on the road and stole from inside the same machine he helped create. The hatred came later. First came grief. Conrad looked away. Gabriel said quietly, "You never told it that way." Conrad answered without turning back, "Because that is not how Peter told it." Gabriel's voice sharpened. Exactly. That one word moved more in the room than all the rest. Conrad finally turned to his son. So this is what it is now. You stand here on his property with his daughter on a sign, and your family is just supposed to disappear behind some driver charity. Gabriel shook his head slowly. No. This is what happens when the truth gets operational. It does not erase you. It just stops organizing around you. Conrad laughed once, bitter and tired. That sounds like something he taught you. Gabriel held his gaze. No. It sounds like something I learned after you stopped being able to explain yourself without using me as padding. We were very still then, the three of us, in that old office with the patched window and the floor soft in the same spot, and the sign on the table like a verdict made out of plywood. Conrad looked at the advisory names again. Then he asked the question that mattered most and least. Why am I here? I answered. Because I wanted you to see what comes next. He waited. I said, you thought the future of this family dispute lived in money and governance, and whether you could embarrass me into a concession. It does not. The future lives in memory that can survive paper. Dale's name survives. Peter's selected version does not. Annie and Gabriel are building something on the truth. You are free to spend the rest of your life defending the older lie if you want, but it will now have to compete with a fund, a training site, board minutes, a witness, and your own son's refusal. He said, so this is revenge. At least he could name it. I thought before I answered because the wrong answer there would have cheapened everything. Then I said, partly. Revenge is too simple a word for what old men want after enough years. What I wanted was this. I wanted you to understand that bringing a dead man's grievance to my daughter's future would not give Peter back his innocence or you back your brother. It would only cost you the respect of the one man in your family still capable of building something honest. The revenge, if you insist on the word, is that you now know it. That hit him harder than the sign. He looked at Gabriel then, not at me. For a second I saw the father stripped of grievance language, stripped of legacy theater, stripped of the false nobility of inherited pain. Just an aging man realizing his son was not coming back to the old script. He said, you would really put your name next to his on this. Gabriel looked at the sign once and then back at his father. Yes, why? Because if I do not help build the truthful version, then I'm still letting your version choose the room. Conrad shut his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he seemed older, not broken, just more accurately built. He said to me, you could have ruined me publicly. I said, yes. You still can. Yes. Then why haven't you? I looked at the old office wall and thought of Helen's voice, Mary's warnings, Annie at the kitchen table, Dale in the boardroom, Gabriel at dinner asking if I trusted him. Then I answered, because destruction is easy and I am not 20 years from proving anything. Because your son does not deserve you as a martyr. Because if I flatten you, Peter's story gets one last gift. He becomes the center again. I am done arranging my life around your brother's talent for damage. Conrad swallowed once. Then he nodded, very slightly, as if some part of him recognized the sentence's truth, even if he still hated being inside it. Vivian was not there. That was deliberate. If she had come, she would have tried to turn the moment into emotion with better shoes. I wanted the men stripped of their interpreters. Conrad looked around the room one last time. Then he asked Gabriel, not me, can this still be repaired? There are questions that arrive too late and know it. Gabriel did not rush him. That was the kindest thing he could have done. Finally he said, not by pretending this week was a misunderstanding. Conrad nodded again. Then he asked, what would repair even look like? Gabriel answered, start by never using Annie, Walter, or my job to tell Peter's story again. Ever. If you want any relationship with me later, it begins with the truth about Dale. Not privately, not with me alone. Publicly enough that the people you told the other version to are forced to hear the correction. Conrad stared at him. That was the price. Not money, not humiliation, correction. The hardest currency for proud men. Conrad said nothing for several seconds. Then he gave the answer I expected and still found sad. I cannot promise that today. Gabriel nodded once. Then we are done today. That was it. No shouting, no threats, no cinematic collapse against the old desk. Conrad put both hands on the table, looked at the sign one more time, and then turned and walked out of the office. Through the window I watched him cross the yard alone. Wind at his coat, shoulders slightly forward. A man leaving the ground where his family myth had just failed to become inheritance. Gabriel stood beside me. After a while he said, do you think he will ever do what I asked? I considered that honestly. Maybe in pieces. Maybe never in the order you would need. Men like him rarely choose truth first. They usually choose loneliness, anger, self-defense, then eventually some small version of truth once the audience has mostly left. He nodded. That sounds right. Then I looked at the sign again and said, you know this is permanent now. Good, he answered. And just like that, the old yard stopped being Peter's ghost and became ours. Spring turned into summer the way it does in Kentucky. All at once, and after too much argument. 1 week, the mornings still had enough cold in them to justify a jacket. The next week, the porch screens were working overtime against bugs with ambition, and every room in my house smelled faintly of cut grass, tomatoes, and whatever book Annie had left face down by the sofa. The Haney Fund launched in June, not with a gala. Dale would have disowned us publicly if we had tried. We did it in a warehouse training bay in Louisville with folding chairs, coffee in big silver urns, drivers in worn caps, 2 local reporters who actually deserved their jobs, and a printed banner Gabriel insisted should contain fewer adjectives than the draft Annie's communications lead first proposed. It said exactly what it needed to say. The Dale Haney Driver Safety Fund, emergency support, recovery grants, training assistance, because injuries do not wait for perfect timing. Dale stood at the front in a button-down shirt and looked mildly offended by every clap, which is his native response to gratitude. Annie handled the local education and retraining piece with the kind of calm confidence that still sometimes catches me by the throat because Helen should have been there to watch it. Gabriel spoke last. He did not mention his parents. He did not mention Peter. He did not mention the dinner. Good. Public truth does not always require public autobiography. Instead, he said this: most people in logistics learn very quickly to respect time, temperature, and margin. What they do not always learn quickly enough is that delayed maintenance is not a line item. It is a decision made against someone else's body. This fund exists because memory should be useful. If we remember injury only as tragedy, we have learned nothing. If we remember it well enough to reduce the next preventable one, then maybe memory has done an honest day's work. That line made even Dale nod, which is rare enough that someone should probably record it in a county archive. After the event, one of the reporters asked how Gabriel came to be involved. He answered without blinking, because truth required better follow-through than silence. That was all. I liked him a little more for not decorating it. The first round of grants went out by August, small amounts by foundation standards, life-changing amounts by actual standards. One driver in Bowling Green, whose shoulder injury had put his family 3 weeks from losing the house. One mechanic's widow in Dayton. 2 retraining stipends in Knoxville. A short-term mobility support package for a refrigerated fleet owner outside Columbus who nearly drowned in medical billing after a wreck. Dale reviewed every single case personally, because he claimed bored people make softer decisions if you let them sit too far from pain. He was right, of course. Work continued too. Gabriel did not just survive the aftermath professionally. He got better. There is a category of leader who becomes sharper after disillusionment, not because pain is secretly good for people, which is a lie lazy philosophers tell, but because once they stop wasting energy protecting a fantasy, all that attention has somewhere more honest to go. He became quieter in some rooms and more decisive in others. He delegated less out of politeness and more out of judgment. He stopped trying to please old men on the board who liked hearing their own voices reflected and started giving them only the information they had actually earned. 6 months after the dinner, Bernard Pike sent me a 3-line note. Ren is stronger now, less eager to harmonize. More dangerous in the useful way. Do not lose him. That was the whole email. From Bernard, it was almost poetry. As for Annie and Gabriel, they rebuilt their engagement slowly enough to make me respect them and just fast enough to spare me another season of floral indecision. They did not resume where they had left off. That was impossible and would have been stupid if it were not. Instead, they started from a more adult place. Separate counsel, clear agreements, a revised timeline. One brutal weekend in a cabin outside Berea where they talked for 11 hours, took a walk, talked for 3 more, and came back looking like 2 people who had survived weather together instead of just standing under it. After that, the wedding became possible again. Not enormous. Helen would never have allowed enormous. Back garden. Early October. 46 people. Real food. No monogram nonsense. String lights because Annie had, against all my earlier assumptions, inherited a small tasteful hunger for atmosphere. And one empty chair in the first row with Helen's photograph tied to the back in a ribbon Annie chose herself. If you are wondering whether that chair nearly killed me, the answer is yes. It also saved me. Both things can happen at once. Conrad and Vivian were not invited. That was Gabriel's decision, not mine, though I supported it so completely. Mary later told me my face looked evangelical when she asked. He sent them a brief note. I am getting married. You are not attending. If a future relationship is ever possible, it will not begin by pretending this is punishment. It will begin after correction, accountability, and time. Do not come to the house. Vivian replied with 3 paragraphs of emotional lace and 1 sentence that almost qualified as ownership before collapsing back into maternal pain. Conrad replied with nothing. 3 weeks before the wedding, Mary called again. I was in the Ashford yard supervising the loading of a refrigerated unit that did not require my supervision, but did require me not to think too hard about napkin colors. She said, "You are going to want to hear this while standing up." I said, "I already am." She said, "Conrad sent correction letters." That got my full attention. To whom? The reporter, Randall Poole, the former banker, Dale, and one to Gabriel copied through counsel. I walked away from the trailer noise until I reached the far fence line. Read me something. She did. To the reporter, a simple correction. Earlier materials I provided concerning Walter Rowan and the 1993 Peter Wren dissolution omitted serious misconduct by my brother, including maintenance fraud linked to the Dayton crash that injured driver Dale Haney. I should not have circulated those materials without full context. To Dale, shorter, more painful for it. Mr. Haney, I repeated my brother's story without honoring the damage done to you. That was wrong. No redemption language, no self-excuse, no reaching for balance, just wrong. I stood by that fence line a long time after Mary stopped reading. Finally she said, I know that silence. Are you moved or irritated? I laughed, both. She said the corrective language still does not meet every condition Gabriel named. There is no direct statement to his son about using Annie or the employment issue. I know. Still, it was movement. Not enough for trust. Enough for closure to stop feeling imaginary. That evening I told Gabriel. He read the letters on my porch while the sun dropped behind the trees and the air smelled like damp earth in the coming cold. When he finished, he handed them back and said, I hate that part of me is relieved. I said, relief is not betrayal. He nodded. Then he said, it is not forgiveness either. No. He sat there a while longer. Then he asked, do you think this means he finally understands? I looked out at the yard and thought of the old office in Columbus, the sign, the wind in Conrad's coat. Maybe not understands, I said. But perhaps he has finally discovered that truth costs less than maintaining the alternative. That was enough for the evening. A week later, Gabriel made his own move. Without asking me. I was proud of that. He met Conrad once, in a lawyer's office in Indianapolis, with his own counsel present and no motherly curtains around the language. He told me about it afterward while we were walking the perimeter of the Louisville crossdock on a cool Friday morning. He said, I told him 3 things. 1, the correction letters mattered. 2, they did not reverse consequence. 3, if he wanted any future with me, he was going to have to learn how to talk about Peter without using him as moral camouflage. I asked, what did he say? Gabriel kicked a loose bit of gravel, watched it skid under a trailer, and answered, less than he wanted to. More than before. He said he had loved Peter first, and questioned him second, and maybe that order ruined his judgment for years. I was quiet after that. Not because I admired Conrad, because I recognized the sentence as the first one in which he had blamed attachment instead of just power. Gabriel looked over at me and said, before you ask, no, I did not hug him. We are not in a movie. I said, thank God. He laughed. Then he added, but I did tell him the door was not locked forever. It just no longer opens from his side. That is as good a boundary as I have ever heard. The wedding came on a Saturday washed with autumn light. Annie walked down the short garden aisle on Bernard's arm because Bernard, who never had children, had been Helen's friend for 20 years and cried harder than I did when she died, which I had not known until the funeral. Annie asked him months ago, and he had simply nodded and gone outside for a while, which in men his age is often the formal version of yes. Gabriel looked steady in the way men look steady when the stakes are high enough that calm becomes a moral project. I stood at the front, not officiating because nobody deserves that risk from me, but close enough to see Annie's face when she reached him. It was not girlish, not naive, not the face of a woman stepping into romance blind. It was better. It was the face of a person who had seen weather and still chosen the house. Their vows were short, thank God again. People who need 10 minutes of promises usually mean 6. Gabriel said, among other things, I will not ask for trust where I have not made room for truth. Annie said, I will not confuse love with silence when speaking is what protects us. If that is not marriage material, nothing is. At the reception, Dale gave a toast so brief it should be taught in schools. He raised his glass and said, to Annie and Gabriel, they know what belongs in a room and what does not. That is half of life. Then he sat down. Perfect. Late that night, after the last guest left and the lights over the garden had gone soft with exhaustion, I walked out to the empty chairs alone. The ribbon on Helen's photograph moved once in the breeze. I stood there long enough for memory to stop feeling sharp and start feeling companionable. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Gabriel. He came to stand beside me and said, I wanted to thank you before we disappear for 2 days and pretend we are younger than our paperwork. I said, no thanks tonight. Only logistics. Did Annie remember the envelope for the cabin reservation? He smiled. She did. Good. We stood there a minute in the dark. Then he said, can I ask you something not ceremonial? Always the best kind. Do you still think of what happened with my parents as revenge? I took a while with that, because by then the word had become smaller than the thing itself. Finally I said, part of me does. The part that remembers that dinner and your father's face when he realized the future he thought he could bargain over did not belong to him. But most of me thinks of it as correction with a pulse. Revenge suggests appetite. I do not wake up hungry for your father. I wake up wanting my daughter safe, this company honest, and the next driver better protected than Dale was. If an old lie had to die for that to happen, I can live with the obituary. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "For what it is worth, the part that still feels like revenge to me is not the board meeting or the sign or even the letters. It is that he has to live knowing he used me at the exact moment I was becoming someone you were willing to trust. I think that will follow him longer than anything legal ever could." He was right. That is the thing about the best forms of revenge. They are not loud enough to flatter the avenger. They are quiet enough to become architecture in the other person's mind. A month after the wedding, the first training day at the Haney Annex went live. No full building yet, just the cleared section, the updated bay, safety modules, brake demonstrations, refrigerated system walkthroughs, and a mechanic from Knoxville who could reduce any group of overconfident young drivers to grateful silence in under 12 minutes. Dale insisted on being there from 7 in the morning, leaning on his cane and complaining about everybody's coffee. Annie coordinated the local technical college partnership. Gabriel handled the operations piece and somehow found a way to make 30 men in reflective vests pay attention to documentation without sounding like a compliance pamphlet. I moved pallets and ignored every sentence that began with "Walter, you do not have to do that." At noon, one of the younger drivers, maybe 24, came up to Dale and asked whether the story about the old Dayton crash was true. Dale looked at him, then at the training bay, then at Gabriel. He said, "True enough to keep you under that truck until you understand why signatures are not maintenance." The driver nodded and went straight back to the brakes module. That was the moment I knew the annex would outlive all of us. Not because of names, because of use. Conrad never came. Vivian sent one wedding gift through council. Waterford crystal, of course. Annie donated it unopened to the school foundation's winter auction and told me if someone wanted to buy symbolic fragility for charity, who was she to interfere? 2 months later, just before Christmas, Gabriel got a letter. Actual paper. Conrad's handwriting on the envelope. He read it in my kitchen while Annie rolled pie crust, and I was supposedly in charge of not overworking the bourbon in the pecan filling. When he finished, he handed it to me. It was not elegant. Good. Elegance would have made me suspicious. Peter lied to me in ways I accepted because accepting them preserved the brother I preferred. I used those lies against people who had not earned that burden. I do not know what to do with how much of my life I built around him now, but I know enough to say I was wrong about you, wrong about Walter, and wrong about Annie. If that matters at all, I am writing it plainly because I do not trust myself to say it well out loud. Below that, a second paragraph. I have enclosed a contribution to the Haney Fund in Peter's name and mine. Use it if Dale will allow it. If he will not, return it. I set the letter down. Annie looked up from the counter. "Well?" Gabriel stared at the paper. Then he said, "I hate that this matters to me." I said, "Stop saying that as if your nervous system is a political weakness." He smiled without much amusement. Annie asked the practical question first because somebody in the family has to. "How much?" Gabriel told her. She whistled. I called Dale. He listened to the situation in silence, then said, "Tell Conrad Wren this. If the money comes clean and without a speech, I will take it. But if he ever tries to stand near a podium and reclaim his brother through it, I will personally become his educational experience." Message delivered. The money came in clean. No speech followed. That was not redemption. Let us keep our feet on the floor. It was one man finally paying toward the truth he had spent too long subsidizing in reverse. But it closed the financial circle in a way I had not expected and did not entirely know I needed. By the time the first anniversary of the dinner came around, life had become itself again in the best possible sense. Not easy, real. Annie still called me too often about grants, and not often enough about the things fathers actually want to hear, like whether she is eating enough protein. Gabriel was running more of the company than he had a year earlier. Mary still thought I confused restraint with drama whenever it suited me. Bernard still wrote 3-line emails that sounded like verdicts. Dale still hated public gratitude and accepted it anyway if the coffee was strong enough. And every now and then, in rooms where people understood the difference between story and record, someone would reference the Haney Fund or the Annex, and nobody would say Peter Wren's name first anymore. That matters. Memory is a real asset. It compounds according to how you manage it. So let me tell you what the revenge actually was in the end. It was not making Conrad leave a restaurant without dessert. Though I admit that helped. It was not the board meeting, not the correction letters, not even the sign in the old yard. The revenge was this. He came to my daughter's future believing old grievance plus strategic timing could force me into terms. He believed his son's engagement, his son's job, and a dead brother's selective papers finally gave him enough proximity to win something history had denied him. Instead, he watched that same son choose truth over blood in front of him. He watched my daughter remain entirely out of his reach structurally. He watched the company close ranks around full records instead of fear. He watched the old yard become a training site named after the man his brother had really harmed. And he had to live long enough to understand that the one future still available to his family now existed only through honesty he had resisted for years. That kind of revenge does not need raised voices. It just needs chairs, paper, patience, and a willingness to let people hear themselves once the room stops protecting them. If you ask me whether I'm satisfied, I will tell you the truth. I am relieved. Satisfaction is for men still counting points. Relief is for men who finally got the knife out of the wall and realized the house can still be lived in. And if you ask me whether Peter Wren ever mattered less than Dale Haney in the final accounting, I will tell you yes. That is the correction. That is the peace. That is the part worth keeping. As for me, I still drive the same truck. I still wear boots. More expensive men think make me look ordinary. I still grow peppers in the back garden and argue with seed packets as if horticulture were a personal insult. Some mornings Annie drops by before work. Some evenings Gabriel comes over with warehouse dust on his cuffs and asks harder questions than most vice presidents know how to ask. On Sundays, Murphy still positions himself wherever food is most likely to become negotiable. And sometimes, usually around dusk, I sit on my porch and think about how close people can come to mistaking access for power. Conrad Wren had access. He had a son at my table. He had my daughter's future in the room. He had old paper and a story polished by repetition. What he did not have was truth, and truth is the only thing that survives long enough to own anything. That was the whole lesson. It still is. Continuity check. This story closes all major lines on purpose. Peter Wren's historical version is confronted with full records, living witnesses, and the missing context around the crash, the shell vendor, and the theft. That line is not left vague. Conrad's motive is completed in 3 stages. First, he tries leverage through dinner and selective documents. Second, he escalates through rumor and governance panic. Third, he is forced to face the future he cannot control, and eventually issues written corrections. He is not magically redeemed, but his arc is completed. Vivian's role is also closed. She enables the strategy, loses her social control of the room, is denied access to Annie's wedding, and never regains influence through emotional softness alone. Gabriel's line is completed. He begins as a capable man walking inside assumptions he does not yet understand. He refuses to become insulation for his parents, keeps his role on merit, helps build the Haney Fund, and reaches a mature boundary with his father instead of a melodramatic all-or-nothing ending. Annie's line is completed. She is not reduced to an object between men. She confronts Walter for withholding truth, forces legal clarity around marriage and trust, joins the fund and annex, and enters marriage with full agency. Walter's line is completed. He begins as a prepared founder and father, wins the dinner battle, then does the harder work of restructuring the future instead of stopping at one clever reveal. He chooses correction over destruction, but never sacrifices clarity. Dale Haney's line is completed. He is no longer background damage in someone else's family myth. He becomes the moral center of the truth, the public witness, and the living foundation of the fund and training annex. The company line is completed. Rowan Freight does not remain a vague empire in the background. Governance is clarified, rumor is neutralized, Gabriel's role is secured on merit, and the old Columbus yard is transformed into something useful instead of haunted. The wedding and future line are completed. Annie and Gabriel do not simply stay together in an abstract way. They rebuild with legal and emotional clarity, marry later on revised terms, and move into a future shaped by truth instead of silence. Revenge summary. The revenge in this story is not loud, and it is not childish. Walter lets Conrad come to dinner, believing he finally has enough access to force terms through old grievance, family pressure, and Gabriel's position inside the company. Then Walter dismantles the lie with full evidence, reveals that Gabriel has actually been building Walter's company, and makes Conrad lose the one thing he truly wanted to keep, which is moral authority in his son's eyes. The revenge then becomes permanent. Walter turns the truth into structure. The board sees the full record. The rumor path is closed. Dale Haney becomes the center of the public correction through the fund and the annex. Annie remains fully out of Conrad's reach. Gabriel helps build the future on truth instead of inherited myth. So the deepest revenge is this. Conrad tried to use proximity to seize the future. Instead, he is forced to watch the future organize itself without him, around the truth he resisted, beside the son he tried to use.